All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our third Pennsylvania Lake Erie Environmental Forum of 2021. My name is Tim Bruno, and I serve as the Chief of the Office of the Great Lakes for Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. And I'm joined by my colleagues, Amber Stillwell, who's the Coastal Outreach Specialist in the Erie office of Pennsylvania Sea Grant, as well as Sea Grant staff person, Kelly Donaldson, who's facilitating our online Zoom meeting today. So for those of you who are new to the Pennsylvania LEEF, we're quickly approaching our 5-year anniversary of informational sessions, which goes back to 2016. This allows participants to gain a deeper knowledge and appreciation of environmental issues that affect our Great Lakes, with special attention to those issues that affect our water quality. We strive to bring you some of the leading experts from within the Great Lakes Basin and outside of it, so that you can take the knowledge you gain here, such as on our topic today, which is discussing climate science and the impacts that climate has on our watersheds and our water quality, and share it with your friends and your family and neighbors and colleagues. It's also an opportunity to bring issues and thoughts forward to begin community conversations on those topics that are most important to everyone who lives, works, and recreates in the Pennsylvania Lake Erie Basin. So there's time scheduled today at the end of the agenda that's devoted to bringing forth new ideas. But if inspiration strikes you during the presentations, I encourage you to please drop your thoughts or questions into the chat section so that we can see those in time. So some of the things I expect that you're going to hear from our presenters here today is that you're going to learn from one of the country's thought leaders, I think, on the most contemporary science surrounding harmful algal blooms. And these are commonly referred to as HABs. You'll hear many times throughout today. We're going to learn how those HABs are affected by climate change and what we can do to mitigate HABs and their effects on our communities and water quality. We're also going to learn about climate change trends in Pennsylvania, what we can expect both now and in the future, and how we are responding to that challenge as a Commonwealth. We'll receive updates from the Regional Science Consortium at Presque Isle on their efforts to monitor Lake Erie beaches and shoreline for HAB conditions and what was observed during the 2021 HAB season. Additionally, there'll be updates on climate resilience planning efforts in Erie County and an announcement from the Master Watershed Steward Program. Also an update from Penn Future regarding their common agenda for protecting Lake Erie watersheds. And so now I want to congratulate Amber Stillwell on her new role at Pennsylvania Sea Grant as the Coastal Outreach Specialist. And I just wanted to extend a sincere appreciation for the work that you've done over the last 2 months to, I think, assemble a compelling series of presenters today. So I'm going to turn it over to you to describe some of the features of our online meeting and how everyone will be able to interact with the presenters and learn more about Pennsylvania Sea Grant.
Thanks, Tim. So thank you all for coming today. And as Tim said, I'm the new Coastal Outreach Specialist with Pennsylvania Sea Grant in the Lake Erie office. My position is jointly shared between Sea Grant and Penn State Extension, where I also serve as the Master Watershed Steward Coordinator for Erie, Crawford, and Warren counties. But I'll be circling back to that later in this meeting. I had the pleasure of working with Marty on many different projects before her retirement, as she worked in this position before I did. I can only hope to live up to her outstanding reputation within this community of environmentally impassioned people. I'll do my best, and I look forward to working with Tim to pull these meetings together to suit the needs of our community. With that, welcome to today's virtual PA LEEF meeting. Although we are all missing in-person gatherings, we are excited at this opportunity to invite folks from across Pennsylvania and the Great Lakes. I encourage you to write in the Q&A box which city or state that you are tuning in from. Unfortunately, the chat has been disabled for this webinar. A few logistics before we get started. Most of you are probably familiar with the Zoom platform by now, but if you have questions, please direct them to the Q&A. Additionally, this meeting is being recorded. We have a very packed agenda, but there are 2 official breaks that are scheduled, and we hope to have some interactive polling questions during those breaks. However, if things start to run behind, we may need to skip those breaks, so feel free to leave and rejoin the meeting as you need to. As I said before, the Q&A is enabled, so you will be able to ask questions after each presenter as time allows. We will also have time for questions at the end of the meeting. If we don't get to all of your questions, we will pass them along to the appropriate presenters and share their responses with you. We will pass along a link to this recording early next week, and included in that email will be a 6-question survey asking about your preferences for the next 2 LEEF meetings. Thank you, and without further ado, I'll turn it back over to Tim for a few Great Lakes updates.
Okay, you're keeping me straight already. Forget everything I said about the chat. No, but there will be opportunities later on in the agenda. So if you have comments or ideas, you'll be able to make them known to the group. So for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, I just wanted to say a quick word about the DEP Office of the Great Lakes. And so we're normally located in the Tom Ridge Environmental Center at the head of Presque Isle State Park in Erie, Pennsylvania. Due to COVID, we've kind of been spread out a little bit and working remotely and from home from separate places, but we're still getting the work done. And you know what the overarching theme of the office is to work with the other Great Lakes states, the Canadian provinces, and the 2 federal governments to work on issues such as water quality and the challenges that are associated with that. Assure that we are protecting water use and against diversions out of the Great Lakes. Looking at these future issues of climate change, climate resilience, and how our communities will begin to deal with those subjects. And then also representing Pennsylvania accurately and I think forcefully to the other outside venues inside of the Great Lakes, such as interstate compact agencies and organizations. And so, you know, we have a multidisciplined staff. We have policy folks, we have technical folks who do biology and water chemistry and coastal resources position. So, you know, we kind of covered the entire gamut. So I'm going to try to keep the rest of my comments a little bit short, but I am going to touch on each one of these overarching topics of water use, water quality, and then some of the funding sources that are coming down through the Great Lakes. The first, I'm going to talk about the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River Basin Water Resources Compact and Agreement. And so this is the compact that governs water use, water diversions, and conservation and efficiency efforts on the Great Lakes for water. And the 2 entities that are charged with oversight of those things of the compacted agreement are called the Compact Council and the Regional Body. And those 2 entities, which Pennsylvania has representation on, will be meeting virtually on December 9th and 10th of this year. And so those meetings are open to the public, and information for you to be able to join in that meeting will be posted at www.glslcompactcouncil.org or also www.glslregionalbody.org. You know, at this upcoming Compact Council and Regional Body meeting, I expect that we're going to be hearing more from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources regarding the Village of Summers Straddling Communities diversion proposal under Compact Section 4.9.1 and Agreement Article 201.1. The Village of Summers is located in southeast Wisconsin, and the proposed source watershed is the Lake Michigan watershed. The water is proposed to be purchased by the city of Kenosha with water intakes in Lake Michigan and at the city of Kenosha. And the Village of Summers proposes to divert water to the western portion of the village in the Mississippi River Basin for the public water supply purposes that include residential, commercial, and industrial uses. The Village of Summers proposes to divert up to an annual average of 1.2 million gallons per day. and proposes to return all of the treated wastewater to Lake Michigan via the City of Kenosha wastewater treatment plant without falls to Lake Michigan at the City of Kenosha. The projected consumptive use of this proposed diversion is 0.12 million gallons per day. So as just a quick refresher, the compact provides for very, very limited exceptions to the ban on diversions of water outside the Great Lakes Basin. The first is a straddling communities diversion, and that's the one that the Village of Summers is proposing. And what that provides for is when a municipality is located on both their political boundary is located on both sides of the basin boundary, that you're able to apply for the exception to provide Lake Erie water or any of the lake's water over the divide to the remaining portion of your municipality, provided it's for public water use, and then all of that water is then returned back to the basin after treatment. The second exception to the ban on diversions is a little bit more wide. It's communities and straddling counties, and it's for any community that needs public water in a county that straddles the basin divide, provided that they meet a very limited set of contingencies inside of that exception. And then the third is intra-basin transfers, in which an entity would want to transfer water across a basin divide from one Great Lake to another Great Lake watershed basin. So if you're interested in more on that, I encourage you to check out those websites that I had mentioned before and participate in learning more about these entities, these interstate and international entities. Fun fact, at the December meeting, Pennsylvania will become chair of both of those organizations for the next year. Under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, I wanted to let everyone know that the Great Lakes Executive Committee is next scheduled to meet virtually on December 1st and 2nd. The GLEC, which is what we commonly refer to it, will receive updates from all the annex subcommittees and progress on numerous topics such as nutrients, lakewide management, chemicals of mutual concern, climate change, and more. So for more information, I encourage you to look for updates on www.binational.net, and you can sign up and register to participate and listen in to the proceedings over those 2 days. You'll learn a lot, I can guarantee you that. Also, the Lake Erie Lakewide Action and Management Plan, which was scheduled for adoption in 2019, is still, I believe, waiting to be finalized by the US and Canada. The states await additional information in that. And one of our monitoring sessions, as you all know, Presque Isle Bay was listed as an area, a Great Lakes area of concern, and was delisted in 2013. And as part of that delisting process, we provided for continual monitoring going off into the future of the sediments and water quality, not only of the bay, but of the contributing watersheds. And in that post-delisting monitoring program, that included sediment analysis, which was scheduled for 2021. Unfortunately, the reference sites that we use to compare results between Presque Isle Bay is located in Canada. And so due to COVID-19, there's been difficulties in accessing that reference site due to border requirements. So hopefully, I don't think that will be conducted this year, but we'll look to next year and hopefully an easing of some of those border restrictions. Some good news in terms of funding, which enables a lot of the programs. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which funds this initiative between DEP and Pennsylvania Sea Grant in having the Lake Erie Environmental Forum meetings. On the federal level, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is currently appropriated at $330 million for this fiscal year. but it's important to note that it's authorized to increase $25 million per year until it reaches $475 million in 2026. Additionally, looking at what's currently taking place in U.S. Congress, there's an infrastructure bill that's currently working its way through the legislative processes, and there's a placeholder for a $1 billion investment in the Great Lakes in that legislation. These are generational investments in both our infrastructure and water quality. And I encourage everyone here to speak with their elected representatives to really start looking at requiring capacity inside of the state, our counties, and local municipalities so that we can engage ourselves in these funding opportunities, apply for, receive the funds, and be able to administer those funds and put them into on-the-ground projects. It's going to require capacity at every level to assure that our communities in Pennsylvania benefit from the proper and thoughtful use of these funds. So hopefully we can begin planning now for these opportunities. I know the Office of the Great Lakes is definitely looking at ways in which we can kind of answer that call to provide future capacity. So I'm going to leave my remarks there so that we can jump into really the substance of our meeting today. And I'm going to turn it back over to Amber Stillwell to lead us into those discussions. Amber?
Thanks, Tim. You do have a couple of questions, if that's all right.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Someone asked if you could post the websites that you mentioned. I think you can just go into the Q&A and write those in the answer, and then everyone will have them. And a statement is that it's the 50th anniversary of the GLWQA.
Yes. Oh, very good. So that will be coming up over the next year. The Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement was enacted in 1972. Well, it wasn't enacted, it was signed. It's an agreement between the US and Canada in 1972. And so this is the big anniversary year that's coming up. And it will I believe it's planned for October of next year. There will be a gigantic 3-day celebration, as well as meeting of the Great Lakes Executive Committee and a series of presentations on progress that has occurred in the Great Lakes over those years. I'm really looking forward to it and learning more about it over the next coming months as they start the planning for that. And I can't remember exactly where it's going to be at, whether it's going to be in the US or Canada, but I commit to bringing more information during our January and March meetings that are coming up. And I will post those websites so that everybody can copy those links and keep them for themselves.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Tim. All right, so as we delve into our special focus for today, which is harmful algal blooms and climate change, I am pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Hans Perl, the Keenan Professor of Marine and Environmental Sciences at the University of North Carolina's Institute of Marine Sciences. He will serve as the senior principal investigator of the project he is presenting today, titled "Where Do We Go From Here? Mitigating Harmful Cyanobacterial Blooms in a World Facing Human Nutrient Over-Enrichment and Climate Change." His collaborative research addresses microbially mediated nutrient cycling and primary production dynamics, environmental controls and management of harmful algal, specifically cyanobacterial blooms and their toxins, and assessing effects of human and climatic alterations of water quality and sustainability of inland, estuarine, and coastal marine waters in the US and globally. Okay, take it away, Hans.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Amber. Let me see. I'm going to share the screen here and hopefully not reveal too much about my personal life and get right into the presentation here. How's that? Can you see the cover there?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Then I'm going to get that little red guy. Oops, no, I don't want the red pen. I want the laser color. Red. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really, for me, it's kind of a homecoming to, to come back to the Great Lakes and lakes in general. I'm a limnologist at heart, as I've explained already to you and Tim, working at a marine institute. But, things are connected, and I think our limnological and marine people are finally coming around to realizing that freshwater to marine systems are really a continuum. And I'm going to talk about that and sort of divide my talk into two sections. One of them will deal with nutrient issues, nutrient limitation, and then we'll get into the climate issue. And then lastly, what can we do about all this with some recommendations? So the one thing I want to do before I really get started is to acknowledge many of my colleagues that have worked with me on issues of cyanobacterial blooms and nutrient dynamics around the world, including colleagues in Europe, China, et cetera. So a little bit of review, and then we'll get into some of the more novel things about nutrients. I think we all know that cyanobacterial blooms are symptomatic of human and climatic alteration, particularly in urban, agricultural, and industrial watersheds, where we're getting increasing nutrient loads, both nitrogen and phosphorus. But also water use and hydrologic modification play roles, and we'll talk a bit about that. And then lastly, it seems like these days no talk is complete without talking about climate change. So we're going to talk about warming and more intense wet and sort of wet-dry cycles and how those play into the playbook of the cyanobacteria that we're going to be discussing. The one thing I want to point out before I really get started on specific systems is that these blooms that I'm going to be talking about are not just a freshwater phenomena. And, for many years, going back into the 60s and even earlier, we thought really this is a lake problem and not really a marine problem. But now it's expanding into estuarine systems, as you can see here in Brazilian lagoons, the St. Johns River in Florida, and Lake Pontchartrain out there by New Orleans, and in coastal systems, the Baltic Sea and other coastal systems now that are experiencing blooms by the cyanobacteria. What drives the cyanohabs? Well, we know a lot about nutrients, and I'll talk a lot about nitrogen and phosphorus, but I also want to really get you to sort of appreciate the physical factors that also control and amplify and ultimately can diminish these blooms. And that has to do with stratification and structuring of the water column itself. When we have strong stratification, that benefits cyanobacterial blooms because they like to come up to the surface and often dominate the surface waters, which eliminates often more desirable algae like diatoms and, of course, benthic plants due to light limitation. So, they have that figured out. They can hog the light during the day, and then at night they come down and get nutrients from the hypolimnion and from the sediments. So, even though they are a very old phylum of microbes, about 2.5 billion years or even longer, their playbook runs very deep, and they've had a lot of time to evolve to dominate systems that have high nutrient loads. The other factor that's important is residence time. That is the amount of time for when a drop of water gets into a system and when it leaves a system. Cyanobacteria, even though they form dramatic blooms, they're actually slow growers if they're compared to other algae. So, the perfect storm scenario then would be having nutrient inputs, often during spring runoff periods, but even summer as well. Then followed by a dry period so that the nutrients are there, they're loaded into the system, but the residence time increases, which gives the cyanobacteria enough time to grow and dominate. And then, so this is kind of the perfect storm scenario, wet followed by dry. And of course, both of these things are getting more extreme. And I'll talk a bit about that, more extreme wet events and more extreme dry events. So those aspects of climate change kind of work synergistically with nutrients to enhance their growth. And then, of course, lastly, light is very important. And since they are dominant in the surface very often, they're not light limited. And they have the ability to move up and down the water column more or less at will, going down often at night to get nutrients and then doing their photosynthetic growth during the day. Lastly, and I'm not going to talk too much about this, in fact, I'm not going to talk at all about this, is the fact that they can perturb the food web because they're often not eaten by zooplankton that prefer other phytoplankton. So they can end up being sort of a dead end in the food chain, producing a lot of carbon that ultimately goes down to the sediments and ends up recycling nutrients that can then maintain the blooms without it really going up the food web. So, you know, there's a lot of harm there to speak of. And then, of course, the other harm is that they're toxic, or some genera produce secondary metabolites that can be toxic to everything from zooplankton up to people. Okay, I'm going to start off with sort of my favorite lake that I've been working on for about 12 years now in China, Lake Tahoe. It's kind of the poster child, in my opinion, of how dramatic these blooms can be within a short period of time. Tahoe is a large lake. It's 2,300 square kilometers. It's about the size of Lake Okeechobee down in Florida. It went from a lake that was dominated by diatoms and very desirable conditions, I would say oligo to mesotrophic, to one that now has 9-month-long cyanobacterial blooms on it. And all that happened within about 2 decades. So, you know, things can happen quickly if you allow nutrients to get in an uncontrollable manner. And of course, one of the big problems in China is the population density. You can see these 2 large cities here, Wuxi and Suzhou. Each one of them now has about 7 to 8 million people in it. 2 decades ago, it was about 2 million. So, you know, all that wastewater that's being generated and urban runoff is adding to the nutrient sort of budget of the lake. It's about 50% ag input and the rest is urban wastewater. So this can happen quickly, hopefully not in your lake, in your backyard, but you know, it's something that certainly is portends the future in many places where we don't control nutrients in a meaningful manner. So what controls these blooms in terms of nutrients? And to do that, we have set up bioassays, which are essentially experiments that are done outdoor in small containers, anywhere from 1 liter to 5 to 20 liters. These cubitaners, I'm sure people have seen them. They're, you know, graduate student proof. They can't break. You can throw them around. They're transparent to photosynthetically active light, and they're easy to clean. So we do experiments with these. And in this particular instance, I'm going to show you 2 years of data from Tahoe, where we had the initial lake water, the control, plus nitrogen, plus phosphorus, and then NNP together. And we were measuring chlorophyll as the growth response in the algae. And what you can see in the spring is that phosphorus stimulates, and that's because there's a lot of nitrogen coming in from that spring runoff in the system. But then in the summer, it flip-flops to nitrogen limitation, and you can see nitrogen coming on here. Same in the second year. If we go to the spring of the second year, here's phosphorus stimulating, but not nitrogen. But then the whole thing flip-flops in the summer with nitrogen stimulating and no phosphorus effect. The key thing I want you to look at is that if you add both nutrients together, you get more than one alone. And this is something that is popping up now in many other systems that I'll talk about. So, you know, it looks like in Tahoe, we're dealing with co-limitation, where phosphorus controls the springtime growth, nitrogen the summertime growth. And in many ways, nitrogen is more important than phosphorus because it's the summertime when we get these big blooms. that are being sustained by having enough nitrogen in them. This is my politician slide. I love to show this one to the Chinese politicians when they come down and they don't really understand anything about the data. But if I showed them what 100 mils of lake water filtered through a glass fiber filter looks like in one of these experiments, you can see the control up here with no nutrients added, nitrogen as nitrate added, phosphorus as phosphate, and N and P together. And then I always ask the question, please put up your hand if you believe that both nutrients are important. And if it works, they all put their hands up, and usually they do. So, you know, there are ways of showing this without having to show them data. So then the question comes up, well, okay, how much do we need to reduce nutrients to get down to some sort of a balanced growth or controllable growth of algae, particularly bloom-forming algae in the system? And to do that, we've designed what are called dilution bioassays. So what we do initially is we dilute the lake water with a diluent which has everything in it except for nitrogen and phosphorus. So it's got all the major ions in it, et cetera. And then we start adding the nutrients back to the diluted system. And that way you can see which nutrient is most limiting, but more importantly, how much you need to dilute the system in order to really get down to a nutrient limited situation. And if you do this in Tahoe, you can see in the spring, you need to reduce phosphorus by about 50% or so, maybe 30 to 50% or so, and nitrogen even more, 50 to 70%, to get true nutrient limited conditions in this system. Now, those seem like big numbers, and they are big numbers, but if you look at the historic loading, the increases in loading that have occurred in the system, they pretty much mirror what we're seeing in terms of dilution. So I think these dilution bioassays can be very useful. And in fact, we're using them now in Lake Erie to basically ask the same question, how much do we need to reduce P or N or both in the system? And let's go to Erie, where I've been involved in the Oceans and Human Health Center that runs out of Bowling Green State University. That is an interdisciplinary center, basically, to look at these harmful blooms from everything from kind of nutrient loading from the watershed to what the limitations are in the system itself, what the impacts of the blooms are in terms of ecosystem health and even human health, because they do produce toxins. And so what I'm showing you here are the two kind of bloom scenarios that we get in Erie, particularly in Western Lake Erie, where Microcystis, which is this guy up here, blooms. Microcystis is a non-nitrogen fixing cyanobacterium. So it has to get its nitrogen from combined sources. In other words, nitrate and ammonium, and maybe even organic nitrogen that's coming in from the watershed or is being recycled in the system. Planktothrix is the other bloom former. It's a filamentous cyanobacteria, also a non-nitrogen fixer. And the reason I mention this is because this kind of emphasizes the role of nitrogen in this system. It's clear that with Microcystis blooming out there in the western part of Erie, we're really looking at an excess nitrogen situation in addition to phosphorus. If we didn't have that nitrogen in there, we'd probably have a nitrogen fixing cyanobacterium and not at the magnitude that we're seeing with Microcystis right now. So that's what these blooms look like. If we do the nutrient bioassay, like the one that I discussed with you in Tahoe on Erie, we get a pretty similar picture. This is, of course, just one time in the summer. This is on Sandusky Bay bloom. But you can see if you add nitrate, you get stimulation. Ammonium, urea, all the nitrogen sources can stimulate. Phosphorus, not so much, but N and P together give you more than N alone or P alone. So very similar kind of picture from what we're getting in Tahoe. And if we dilute by 40%, which is, of course, the kind of to mimic what's been prescribed for Erie in terms of phosphorus reductions, you can see that clearly there is a reduction in the growth potential, so that's good. But this is, of course, a 40% dilution of both nitrogen and phosphorus. And here's our setup out here at Put-in Bay, the Ohio State University lab that we're using for our experimental work. It's very nice, real close to the lab, and we can do all our experiments out there outdoors. Okay, so let's look at some other systems. And I wanted to cover an area that is interesting because these are lakes that have been manipulated. The entire lake has been manipulated by fertilization, and I think most of you are aware of the Canadian lakes project that's been going on for a long time, ELA, the Experimental Lake Area. But there are other places where whole lakes are being fertilized to test which nutrients are important to control the growth of the cyanobacteria or whatever is blooming there. And you can see if you add nitrogen, yes, you do get stimulation above the control. The control would be the unfertilized situation. P does stimulate, but interestingly enough, often not as much as N, although there are some lakes that respond to P. But if you add N and P together, you get more than N alone and P alone. So, you know, experiments that we do that are only 1 liter or 5 liters often can tell you what a whole lake experiment can tell you in terms of which nutrients are limiting and which ones we need to be concerned about. And the picture is emerging now that both N and P are important. We published a paper on this that I'm more than glad to share with everyone. If you look at these lakes and do a kind of a summary on them in terms of the mean percentage above the control of stimulation, 9 lakes responded to phosphorus, 4 to N, but 12 lakes to N and P together. So it takes 2 to tango. That's really the moral of that story. And if we look at other bioassays that have been done now, these range all the way from simple bottle experiments to mesocosms and larger enclosures. Generally, we see that N and P together give you the most stimulation as opposed to just P alone and N alone. Now, some of you might wonder, in limnology, if you read a textbook in the 60s, nobody even talked about nitrogen. It was all about phosphorus and the big phosphorus problems that we were having in Lake Erie and other places. But, we've been fertilizing these lakes now with phosphorus and nitrogen for, well over 100 years in some places. And it turns out that a lot of these lakes have accumulated a lot of phosphorus in them, and phosphorus doesn't leave that easily from a system. So we have this big legacy phosphorus effect in these lakes. And that's partly one reason why we're getting nitrogen stimulation now too. Nitrogen can leave more easily by denitrification, for example, and it's more mobile than phosphorus. So I think over the years, what we've been seeing is more of a co-limitation and even nitrogen limitation showing up in our lakes. And it turns out that very few systems now you can really control primary production and blooms with only treating one nutrient. So the moral of the story is you got to deal with both N and P together. Okay, the second part of my talk deals with the interactive effects of climate change, particularly warming and increasing hydrologic variability that we're seeing, more rain and more droughts, which we know impact blooms. And be more than glad to share the paper that we got this from too, which was a paper in harmful algae, and one that we published on the algal bloom situation going all the way from the freshwater to marine continuum. We know that things are warming up. This is the North Atlantic temperature anomaly down here. You can see that over 100 years, things are shifting to a warmer climate. That has led to more storms, hurricanes in this case, and tropical cyclones, which are increasing. And this is certainly something we're concerned about in North Carolina, where we're getting whacked by these systems more or less on a regular basis. So temperatures increased overall, and we're getting more of these episodic events, delivering lots of rain in a short period of time. and we're having record droughts. This is from the West Coast or from the Colorado River Basin. So if we look at this situation, we can see how this might also benefit cyanobacteria. Because it turns out if you look at temperature versus growth, maximum growth, in diatoms, dinoflagellates, chlorophytes with green algae, and cyanobacteria, you can clearly see that the optimum or the maximum for cyanobacteria is way up in here in the higher temperatures. So basically cyanos like it hot compared to other algae that they're competing with. So the warmer it gets, the bigger advantage they have because their growth rates are optimized at high temperatures. And if you look at some lakes that have had these increasing cyanobacterial problems, this is data over here from the Netherlands from Jeff Huisman, looking at lakes in Holland, the epilimnion, you can see that over well over 100 years now, the epilimnia of these lakes has been warming up. And even in Erie now, there seems to be some suggestion that temperatures are increasing overall. You, of course, have colder years and warmer springs or colder springs. So there is a lot of variability in this data set. But overall, you can see that things are tending or trending up towards warmer temperatures. So temperature increases are favoring this group of problematic organisms over the more desirable algae that we like to have in the system. And if we look at field data on many lakes that have been surveyed going all the way from the tip of South America to the Arctic Circle, this is data from Zarnecki from the Netherlands again. They found that if you look at the relationship between temperature and in this case, total nitrogen, you can see that the highest percentage of cyanobacterial biovolume occurs at the high temperatures and high nitrogen content in these lakes. So there is a story there. There's also a relationship to phosphorus, but it turns out actually that the relationship with nitrogen is even stronger. So, you know, warm temperatures or warming plus increased nutrient loading is definitely increasing the cyanobacterial dominance in lakes in general. If we go to Erie, a little bit of history in Erie. Of course, I think many of you know a whole lot more about this than I do. But, you know, Erie had this problem already with cyanobacterial blooms back in the 60s. That problem was largely dominated by nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria, like Anabina and Aphanasomena. These are probably names that some of you know about. Phosphorus removal was prescribed to deal with the cyanobacterial problem back in the 60s, and that was mainly point source reduction at wastewater treatment plants in urban centers around the lake. And it was successful in reducing these nitrogen-fixing blooms for at least several decades. But over the last decade or so, the blooms have come back. I don't need to tell you about this. You see them more than I do out there in Erie. And they're dominated by a non-nitrogen fixer now, Microcystis. So, you know, nitrogen is starting to play a more important role in this system as well. That doesn't mean we don't need to reduce phosphorus. That's a given. But I think we need to get serious about nitrogen reductions now as well. And this, of course, is the bloom in Western Lake Erie that's fed by the Maumee River coming in from big agricultural watersheds over here to the west. The blooms in Erie have been increasing in severity. I think everyone knows this. You know, there are some ups and downs here, but they have to do with climatic variability, temperature shifts in certain years, but also runoff changes. But overall, we're seeing an increase now that started in the early 2000s. And, you know, it's been speculated that the earlier start is probably a result of rapid early warming in Lake Erie starting at the end of May. If we look at the bloom initiation in Erie and the termination, both of those are increasing. The first day of the bloom which typically tends to be at least 17 degrees, is occurring earlier in the year. And the last day of the bloom is occurring later in the year. So the window of opportunity for these blooms is increasing in Erie, and it's increasing in other places too. And overall, Western Lake Erie has experienced the 1 to 2 day increase in growing days per year since 2002. And you can see that here in the plot on the right, where the number of growing days is steadily increasing. So, you know, climate is an additional challenge to reducing nutrients as well. You can kind of think of it as sort of raising the bar, and it may be that we need to reduce nutrients more as temperatures are increasing and the opportunity for these blooms is increasing as well. So just to conclude a few things on Erie, let me just get out of this little window that I've got up here. Oops. Okay, well, changes in water temperature patterns are leading to longer bloom windows. And so things are starting earlier and lasting later into the fall. The increased growth potential could lead to blooms intensifying earlier in the year. And this leads to an increased risk, obviously, for water managers and recreational users and water supplies because of the toxins that are produced by these blooms. But temperature is not the only factor driving the blooms. And we're going to just finish the story here by talking about hydrology, particularly freshwater runoff due to more extreme storm events, followed by droughts. And if we look at the Erie watershed, you know, we're getting more rain, more extreme rainfall events, which obviously are leading to more nutrient input events. And if that's followed by a drought in the summertime, you kind of have perfect conditions because you put the nutrients in the lake and now you're increasing the residence time. The flushing rate goes down with a protracted drought. So basically this plays right into the playbook of the cyanobacteria. If we look at other places, we're getting a similar story. This is North Carolina. This is the upper part of the Albemarle-Pamlico Sound system, where we have Albemarle Sound, which is a brackish system. It's cut off from the ocean by the Outer Banks out here. The salinity here runs about 5 to 10 parts per thousand. So, you know, about a quarter or a fifth of seawater salinity. We're getting impacted by these increasing storm events and hurricanes, which are bringing more nutrients in through pulse loading down our rivers into this system. And you can see how it's starting to encroach. This is chlorophyll, by the way, detected by satellite. And we're now really being concerned about not only having blooms in our tributaries, but also in the open Albemarle Sound, which is a huge problem. This is probably one of the best crab fishing regions in North America. And, you know, crabs eat everything, including whatever falls on the sediments. And if these are toxic algae, there is the possibility for transmitting the toxin up the food web. If we look at Louisiana, where, of course, the big rivers drain into the northern Gulf of Mexico, this is the Mississippi and the Atchafalaya coming in. We're getting more storm and flood events, which is freshening the Gulf of Mexico here in the receiving waters. And as a result, it's opening a niche for cyanobacteria to bloom in waters that are sort of, you know, characteristically marine, but they're getting fresher due to these storm events. That's leading to more cyanobacteria dominating the phytoplankton and toxicity associated with it. And this is data from Sybil Bargu and her group down in LSU that have been looking at very similar issues of the cyanobacteria spreading or transferring from the sort of traditional freshwater systems out into the sounds and coastal waters. And then if we look at Lake Okeechobee, the largest lake in Southeast, Okeechobee, of course, is a reservoir that's managed by the Army Corps of Engineers. It has had a long history of cyanobacterial blooms, largely due to non-point source loading from agricultural inputs, but also urban loading now from places like you know, major cities that are in the area here. And one of the problems is with more hurricanes and more tropical cyclones impacting these systems, there's the need to release water from Okeechobee. Otherwise, the levees will burst. So they're releasing water down here to the west through the Caloosahatchee River system to the Gulf of Mexico, and to the east here to the embayments that we see, estuarine embayments on the Atlantic side. And as a result, basically, these blooms are being transferred out of the system into our estuarine and coastal waters. If the freshwater runoff is high enough, it'll actually freshen up some of these systems so the cyanobacteria can just merrily grow. But if it's salty, they'll be killed, but their toxins will be released in the water. So, you know, it's kind of a damned if you don't, damned if you do kind of situation. You're going to have a big water quality problem here in the receiving estuarine systems. And, you know, this is sort of the scenario then. The lake drains, it's going down the Caloosahatchee, blooms in front of, you know, $10 million places, and out here in the estuarine systems where the toxins can get absorbed in the food web. We get hurricanes and tropical cyclones, and this is just some data from the New River Estuary in North Carolina, which is a estuary that's behind a bar-built barrier island, so it tends to be oligohaline, you know, low to medium salinity, and also fairly long residence time. And so what I'm showing you here is data from a vertical profiler that we've had in the place up here in the entrance to the estuary. And what I'm going to do here, if it works, okay. So we had Tropical Storm Hannah that came along in 2008. And here's the wind field. You can see the wind mixing the system entirely. This is a very shallow system. So everything is uniform here. Temperature, salinity, dissolved oxygen, chlorophyll. And here's the turbidity from the sediment resuspension that's going on in the system during the storm. And what I want you to focus in on here is chlorophyll. So there was a bloom here in this system. You can see it up near the surface of mainly cyanobacteria. Then the hurricane came along and essentially destroyed the bloom or mixed it throughout the water column. But then, with only a few days afterwards, once the system started to stabilize and stratify again, the bloom came back even larger than it was before. And we think that that happened because of sediment resuspension, putting nutrients back up into the water column. And then, of course, also runoff from the watersheds up here, bringing nutrients in. But the immediate effect is really that sediment resuspension. So sediments play an important role in sustaining the bloom, particularly if you can resuspend them in the system during storms. If we go back to Tahoe, I get a similar situation. This is satellite imagery of chlorophyll A in the lake. And you can see these blooms that tend to form along the western and northern part of the lake. I've been there enough times to have experienced typhoons there, so I thought it'd be kind of neat to show data of what the system looked like before and after the typhoon in terms of chlorophyll. And then there was a year where we had no typhoons over in forget what year that was, 2010, I think. So here's one year with a typhoon. Here's the other two. And what you can see is that after the typhoon, you get a much higher production of chlorophyll A and an extension of the bloom. So very similar to what we see in our estuaries, nutrient resuspension from sediments. And these are mostly legacy nutrients that have accumulated in the lake, but then also runoff coming afterwards. So, you know, cyanobacteria have figured out how to take advantage of almost anything now that involves climate change, certainly including temperature increases and more extreme events in terms of rainfall and droughts. And this is the ultimate challenge then in Tahoe is, you know, we're trying to control these blooms with nutrient reductions, but what's happening is the wind speed is decreasing over time. due to large-scale climate changes. So that favors their growth on the surface due to buoyancy. Okay, so that's one strike against us. Temperatures increasing over time, including nighttime temperature, by the way, which plays an important role. And we're getting more extreme rainfall events. So as a result, we're producing more chlorophyll A with lower wind speeds in the system. And that, of course, is a challenge in terms of nutrient reduction. And it looks like we need to reduce nutrients even more than what we're seeing in the dilution bioassays, because the climate is favoring these cyanos to expand more and dominate more. So what can we do about all this? Or what do we know about this at this point that I can sort of transmit to you that we're certain of in terms of management issues? Well, it looks like in most cases, both N and P inputs need to be reduced. And those nutrient bloom thresholds are system specific. So you need to really look at the relationship between nutrient inputs and blooms in each system. You can use bioassays for that purpose. In many cases, at least a 30% reduction in both N and P is needed. And that's not surprising, again, if you look at the historic increases that have occurred in these systems. Salinity is not necessarily a barrier to their expansion, particularly if it's low salinity. So that's one thing to keep in mind as well in terms of coastal systems. And we may need to reduce N and P inputs even more in a warmer, stormier world, because blooms like it hot, and episodic and extreme events favor Cyanohabs. That is, the flood drought cycle is becoming more intense. And then lastly, and I've been asked this question a lot, okay, do we need to reduce P in the spring and N in the summer to get around this dual nutrient limitation issue? The answer is you got to reduce nutrients year round, because in many places, the residence time is so long that whatever nutrients you put in are going to stay in the system for an appreciable amount of time. So there's no seasonal, N and P reduction in most cases. You really need to tackle it on a year-round basis. And then lastly, warmer, longer growing seasons are definitely in the mix. In Nordic places, earlier ice off, later ice on. That's just expanding the window of opportunity for these blooms to form. So climate change is definitely playing into the cyanobacterial playbook. And I might just end by saying, that's not too surprising, because they've been around for almost 3 billion years. They've seen warming trends and cold, glacial periods, volcanism, et cetera, et cetera. It's all built into their DNA. They know how to take advantage of these more extreme events that we're now seeing. So, the nutrient knob is really the only one that we can really, 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 really tweak in order to have long-term controls. I mean, there are short-term management strategies. Many of you are aware of those, like enhanced mixing, putting chemicals in the water to kill the algae, stuff like that. But it doesn't really help reduce the nutrient issue. You still have to have nutrient reductions. Dredging, for example, is another strategy. If you don't reduce the nutrients in parallel with these other schemes that are being enacted in lakes, I think we're not going to win the battle. So I think I'll stop there, and hopefully I didn't run too long with my talk, and leave some time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. That was really wonderful.
I'll be more than glad, if there's time, I'll be more than glad to answer any questions.
There's a lot of time. I'm going to give the participants a little bit of time to enter some questions into the Q&A. So I just want to remind everyone, if you have your hand raised, I can allow you to speak, but for this portion, we'd rather you type your questions into the Q&A box, and then I can relay them to Hans. But for now, do we have questions for Hans from our panelists while we're waiting for participants?
Yeah, I certainly do. And Hans, thanks for the presentation. This is really kind of supporting all of the current science that's coming to the federal and state governments at this time about the correlation between climate change, HABs, and just how challenging it is to address all of the different variables for inputs. And as you know, US and Canada and the states have agreed to a 40% reduction, trying to achieve a 40% reduction in phosphorus inputs into Lake Erie to try to achieve, harmful algal bloom extent on an annual basis that's no greater than one of our reference years that happened back in 2013. So that being said, I was interested about some of the information you gave us from Lake Tahoe. And I was wondering if you could just give us some context about the conditions that are currently happening inside of that basin there, in terms of the inputs of nutrients to that system compared to what Lake Erie looks like, because you mentioned the major sources kind of mimic what Lake Erie is,
Yeah, it's
municipal
about
storm
50-50.
wastewater treatment and agriculture. In Lake Erie, going back to the Clean Water Act and the original Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, we had to do severe reductions on and put into place municipal wastewater treatment and reduce the levels and discharges. We've done a pretty good job. I mean, to the point where we've got them down to we've got like the 98% of the things that you can do reasonably for a certain amount of money. And now we're into that tougher part, but we've seen that, the Maumee River watershed and agricultural inputs and other watersheds around Lake Erie are really the drivers. So can you do that, compare and contrast real quick?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Tahoe, about 60% of the input is non-point source. So that would be chemical fertilizers, urban runoff, urban stormwater runoff, and then sort of mysterious kinds of things like animal operations and stuff like that are kind of the Chinese play shell games with. The 40% is urban. And in Tahoe, I'm actually pretty hopeful that they're going to be able to reduce nutrients pretty dramatically, because their wastewater treatment, is far behind ours in terms of what's being taken out. So advanced wastewater treatment is going to have a pretty big effect on reducing nutrient inputs, both N and P. We still have the non-point source big slice of the pie to deal with. And what is happening, well, so one interesting thing is that, when I first started working there, the Chinese thought they could solve all their problems by just reducing P. I already mentioned that, but they're basically pursuing N now too. And one nice thing about the one-party system, there may not be too many nice things about it, but one thing about it is that if they agree with you, it's going to happen, And so they actually now are aggressively looking at nitrogen reductions as well, both at wastewater treatment plants and in terms of non-point sources, they're extending riparian buffers and creating artificial wetlands to intercept nutrients that are coming down from intensive agricultural areas. And really, that's a strong parallel to what we need to do in the Midwest and what we need to do in North Carolina and other places. Is we really need to use as much of a sort of natural way of what am I trying to say? Attenuating nutrients by using natural vegetation to take up those nutrients. Now, that's not going to work in a hurricane, but it's going to work in your average rainfall precipitation kind of situation. And that's certainly something that I think needs to be more intensively used in watersheds around Erie. I was rather shocked. I went to a meeting, well, this was several years ago at Bowling Green, and I was shocked to find that almost all the agricultural fields have no buffers around them at all. There's no riparian buffers around agricultural fields, when research that's been conducted here in NC State, for example, has shown that you can reduce nitrogen runoff from agricultural fields by 50% just by putting a 50-foot buffer zone around these agricultural areas. So the Chinese are starting to do this. The problem in China is that there ain't a whole lot of land to do anything with. Almost every square inch of land is spoken for in terms of, a farmer living there or, a town or city. But we have that luxury in the US. We still have space and land to be able to use that to, attenuate these nutrient inputs. So buffers are, I think, a very good strategy. And, if we can pay farmers not to grow crops, we can certainly pay them to put buffers in as well. That's sort of almost a no-brainer. Artificial wetlands, where they can be put in place, are very effective, particularly for nitrogen, for reducing nitrogen through enhancing denitrification. Applying fertilizers, in a smart agronomic way, rather than to just put it out there. And I think we all know that even at home, we like to put a little bit more on our lawn than what's actually really needed. So agronomic rates of fertilizer application, and applying fertilizers subsurface, not just spreading them out or putting, animal waste, et cetera, on the surface. I mean, I've seen situations where it's been applied actually when the ground is still covered by snow. Well, that's not gonna do anybody any good. And so smart applications. And then, of course, you want to minimize putting fertilizers on during the very high wet runoff periods in the spring, as much as you can. And then lastly, urban stormwater runoff. Urbanization is having an increasing impacts too in non-point source loading. And so good urban stormwater retention, putting buffers around developments, urban developments, not just agriculture fields, but urban developments is a really good strategy. It's interesting here in North Carolina, the farmers have been convinced of buffers, and the state is actually helping subsidize some of that. But the urban developers, they just want to develop all the way down to the water's edge and then put a nice green lawn in there right at the edge to make things worse. So, we're very quick to point the finger at agriculture, but I think there are a lot of urban situations where we could also help retain nutrients in a better way. And then, in rural areas, effective, what am I trying to say here? Wastewater through septic systems and things like that. There are often a lot of defective septic systems that really need upgrading and better maintenance.
Yeah, and I'll also add, that we've had a proliferation inside of the western part of the basin of Lake Erie, concentrated animal feeding operation.
Yep.
In which you have a tremendous amount of manure and waste products produced, which are an actual commodity that is sold to, farmers who have row crops and applied as a nutrient.
Yeah.
And I think that's all part of all of these management considerations that need to be looked at in terms of a regulatory perspective, and how you cooperate with those landowners to meet the reductions that you need inside of the lake. And my next question feeds into Carl DePolt's question on our Q&A section here. You had mentioned internal loading, and internal loading is essentially the phosphorus that's trapped inside of the sediments that are inside of the rivers that discharge to the lake, as well as the lake sediments.
Right.
And so Carl had asked, if we stopped all discharges to Lake Erie, how long would it take for Lake Erie to recover? And that's a really good question, Carl.
I don't have the answer
one
to
that all of us wish we had
but I can tell you, I don't have the answer for Lake Erie. My guess is with a lake the size of Erie and its retention time, which I think is something like 7 or 8 years or something.
It's 2.5 years retention time.
Yeah, 2.5. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty good actually. But Carl Havens, my former colleague in Florida, calculated that if they stopped all the phosphorus inputs around Lake Okeechobee, it would still take 50 years for the internal load to get down to some sort of threshold level. So that's another strong argument for nitrogen, reductions as well, because we know nitrogen will leave systems more easily. And the question has been raised that, okay, if you reduce nitrogen, aren't you just going to encourage the growth of nitrogen fixing cyanobacteria and go back to the 60s, to that scenario we had back then? But we know from experimental work that there isn't enough nitrogen being fixed by these cyanobacterial blooms to really replenish what you would be losing through, say, denitrification in those systems. So I think we can safely reduce nitrogen without worrying about, going from microcystis back to Anabina, for example, in these systems. But, the answer for Erie is likely to be certainly on the decadal time scale. But I think that, what was it, 2.6 years, 3 years, something like that. That's actually fairly short for a large lake. And of course, that's due to the shallowness of Erie. So, you got to start somewhere, but don't expect to fix overnight. That's what I tell my Chinese colleagues. They always like to say, how long is it going to take, to get this fixed?
And that's especially difficult from a public investment standpoint. And I want to make that clear to everyone who's with us here today, that often when you see large investments of, say, $300 million per year in the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and the fact that all of these on-the-ground best management practices are happening with that money, that we can't necessarily expect to fix the issues inside of Lake Erie with harmful algal blooms overnight. Yeah. And then it's going to take a lot of patience as well as a lot more additional investment time for us to reach those things.
And if you don't do anything, then the bar is just going to get raised higher and higher.
It continually gets worse, right? You have to hurdle higher and higher if you don't immediately start taking action.
Yeah. Now, there are a lot of these sort of strategies that are being used to remove phosphorus, like dredging, for example. But, a lake on the order of Erie or even Okeechobee, it's not feasible. The Chinese tried it in Tahoe, and they actually made the situation worse because all they were doing was resuspending sediments out there in the lake that was feeding the blooms to be even larger, because dredging is not such a clean operation, as you probably know.
I will turn. I know we're starting to get near toward the end of this section, and Michelle Niedermeyer had brought up municipal, state, and federal policies that need to or do exist relating to residential and/or agricultural reduction of nutrients. And Michelle, that's a really complex answer, especially on Lake Erie as we see it. If we talk about just this side of the lake and not Canada, there's binational agreements between U.S. and Canada. There's there's federal level laws and regulations on water quality and nutrients. There's state types and local ordinances that govern these things, and it's probably more than what we could get into right now. But if you have additional questions on that, please reach out to me, and I can help better explain that. Additionally, Izzy Laurie had a couple of questions here also. How do American scientists get to study lakes in China? That's a good question. I do want to, if we just shortly, if you could address that.
Well, don't believe everything you read in the newspapers. That's my first answer. The Chinese and American researchers actually have had a pretty long relationship. in terms of dealing with water quality issues. And unlike politics, you know, we all sort of have the feeling we're all in the same boat in China and the US. And so collaborations have been established for quite a long time. They are increasing. Unfortunately, COVID has really, you know, curtailed the person-to-person interactions. And actually, it's curtailed my ability to go to China to work with the Chinese. But they still are collecting data and keeping it in freezers. And until the embargo stops, we're going to have a whole lot of samples to analyze back here in the US. And we're writing papers together. We are sharing a lot of really good information on these kinds of things that I've talked about, on strategies, and science will survive the politics. I guess that's my final answer.
Hear, hear. Well, thank you so much, Doctor. We appreciate you coming and taking time out of your day to bring us up to speed on some of the science that's been going on all over the world, and as well as how it applies here. And we very much appreciate it.
Great. Well, I'll tap in. I'm going to stick around and listen to what else folks have to talk about.
Wonderful, wonderful. And if you see some things pop up in the question and answer that pertain to your presentation, please feel free to go ahead and answer those.
Yeah, and one last thing, if anyone would like any reprints of any of the stuff that I've talked about, go to my website. We have a whole list there. You can just click on it and download all the publications and stuff that I've talked about.
That'd be great. If you could include a link inside the chat, that would be excellent. We can have that for
Okay, I'm going to do that right now.
Okay, Amber, I'm going to turn it back over to you, as I think you're going to introduce the next section.
Sounds good. Thank you, Hans, and thank you, Tim. What wonderful questions from everyone. The next thing that's on our agenda is actually a quick break. So we will take just 5 minutes. During this 5-minute break, I'm going to launch a poll and you get to test out your best knowledge of the Great Lakes with some pretty easy, hopefully answerable questions. So come back in about 5 minutes at, let's say, 2:23 and answer this poll while you are gone.
Hey, Amber, I got one last question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you know, you have emails from me and my website is down there at the bottom of my emails. Mm-hmm. Can you just convey that to everyone?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And then that way, I don't see a chat box here, so.
Yeah, unfortunately the chat is disabled and I can't go back and enable it. But what I can do is put your website in my meeting minutes, and I will also include it. I'll say it when we get back. Does that make sense? I can like verbalize it.
Okay. And I'm sorry I can't vote because I think I know the answer to those questions.
You can vote anyway. That's okay. Okay, get your final votes in, and I'm going to close the poll pretty soon. I have about 75% of the responses. All right, I think we have everybody. Welcome back. So let's go over the results of this poll. So the first question was, which Great Lake is the shallowest? And almost everybody voted Erie, and that's true, it's Erie. The second question is, how much of Earth's freshwater is in the Great Lakes system? And just about everybody got this one right as well. It's 20%, which is a lot of water. This third question tripped some people up. So how many people rely on the Great Lakes as their primary freshwater drinking source? And I didn't put the word primary in there, but should have, and I apologize for that. But this was based on the primary use of the drinking water for Lake Erie, or for the Great Lakes. And the answer is actually 40 million people. So a lot of people voted 30 million, but it's 10 million more than you thought. So thank you all for voting, and I appreciate your responses. And I'm going to move things along here and introduce our next wonderful presenter. So up next, following along with our special focus in harmful algal blooms and climate change, we're going to hear from Greg Zarnecki, the Director of Applied Climate Science with Pennsylvania DCNR. He oversees climate change adaptation planning for the Commonwealth's 121 state parks and 2.2 million acres of state forests, and is the author of DCNR and Climate Change, Preparing for the Future, which outlines a strategic approach to dealing with the impacts of climate change on Pennsylvania's natural resources. He previously served as the Executive Director of the Wild Resource Conservation Program, Director of the Nature Conservancy's Pennsylvania Science Office, and is the Ombudsman for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. An Erie native, Greg received his degrees from Gannon and Edinburgh universities and has served on the faculties of numerous colleges and universities. We welcome Greg's presentation today titled Climate Change and Penn's Woods, What Does the Future Hold? So take it away, Greg.
Thanks, Amber, and thank you everybody for having me today. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. All right, can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, well, thanks again for inviting me today. I'm excited to be here. And what I want to do is kind of give you an overview of some of the impacts we're seeing from climate change in Pennsylvania now, talk a little bit about some of the projections for the future, and say a little bit about what we're already doing to try to deal with those impacts. So to begin with, I'm going to kind of start with big picture and look at what we're seeing globally, because it really helps set the stage for and explain some of the impacts we're seeing already. So if you take a look at the graph to the left, that's a global temperature anomaly chart. And you know, as you probably know, the way you interpret this is that areas that are yellow and red are significantly warmer than historic averages. And if you take a look, the first thing that's going to jump out at you is that it's a lot redder, therefore a lot warmer when you look at the Arctic. And so that really has a big influence on the weather and climate that we see here in Pennsylvania. So if you take a look at the graphic on the right, you'll see a depiction of sea ice extent. This is from September of last year. If you take a look, there's kind of an orange line here that I'm kind of tracing with my cursor. That's the normal sea ice extent for that time of the year. And you can see that there's a lot more open water than normally there would be. I mean, the other thing, it doesn't really show up in this picture, but the ice that is there is much thinner than it normally would be. And so that's important because it really, that open water explains why the Arctic is warming as fast as it is. And it's a result of something we call the Albedo Effect, which is depicted in this kind of graphic. If you take a look at the bottom, you'll see that as the sunlight strikes the surface with ice and snow, about 90% of the energy is reflected back into space as light. Only 10% is converted to heat. But if you go to the top pictogram there, you'll see that when the sunlight hits open water, fully 90% of it is converted to heat. Only 10% 10% is refracted back into space. So when you get that open water, you get a lot more heat being absorbed, which melts a lot more ice. And so it just feeds upon itself. It's a positive feedback loop. And so every year this accelerates further and further and further. And as we go along, I'll explain how this relates to our weather. So now let's kind of jump from the global perspective down to the national perspective. And this is from the 4th National Climate Assessment, which is done every year, or every other year, I should say. There's a new one being worked on right now. But this shows you the temperature anomalies for the US. And you can see almost the entire country is red, showing that it's warmer, significantly warmer than average. And if you look at the two maps below, you can see, particularly during the winter time, we're seeing much warmer temperatures. Also seeing it during the summer, but it's not quite as severe as during the winter. Now we could break this down even further. And if we looked at time of day, evenings and nighttime is much warmer than it used to be, much more so than even daytimes. And so this is I've been setting quite a few records. September, for example, was the warmest ever in Pennsylvania. We had the warmest evening temperatures. And so the records just keep falling. So, you know, as we kind of continue looking at where this is going to take us, these are projections. And so this is from the 2021 Climate Impacts Assessment that DEP released, maybe 4 or 5 months ago. And so let's start at the top. And this is a look at the average annual temperature change. The map on the left is mid-century, which really isn't too far off. The map on the right is the end of the century. Now, to kind of put this in perspective, so far in Pennsylvania, we've seen a 1.8 degree Fahrenheit temperature increase. And as you'll see as I go through my talk, just that 1.8 degrees has led to some significant changes. But if you look at the middle of the century, you're going to see it increases quite a bit more. And at the end of the century, it really is really significant. Now, this is what we call the worst case scenario. This is if we don't get our emissions under control and keep doing what we're doing, which is the path we're on right now. Hopefully that's going to change, but it hasn't yet. But let's take a look at that map on the right, which is the end of the century. So this is the average annual temperature, and take a look at Erie. Erie is going to see at least a 5 times greater temperature increase than it's already seen. And as you probably know, Erie is ranked in the top 20 cities in the US that is the fastest warming cities. Now, the 3 maps you see below look at not average annual temperature, but high temperatures during the summertime. And so it looks at the number of days where the temperatures are going to be over 90 degrees. On the left side there is kind of the historic record. And you can see most of the state had, anywhere from 0 to just a few days a year that were above 90 degrees. If we continue this off to the end of the century, you can see there are parts of the state where we could see fully 3 or more months out of the year where the temperature is going to be above 90 degrees. And needless to say, there are a lot of human health implications as well as ecological implications that come along with that. So let's try to put this in a way people can understand. I mean, when you talk about this many degrees and that many degrees, it's a little hard to wrap your head around. And so there's this cool website called 1001 Blistering Future Summers, where you can look at the projections for the average annual summer temperature towards the end of the century. So Erie's average annual summer temperature right now is 76.8 degrees. By the end of the century, it's going to be over 88 degrees. So Erie is going to feel like Coral Gables, Florida. So you may have been to Coral Gables, Florida, or Florida in general and say, I like it there. And that, yeah, Florida is great. But think about the kind of plants and animals that live in Erie and in Pennsylvania. Think about the kinds of crops that we grow in Pennsylvania. And it certainly is nothing like Florida. So it would be literally catastrophic if this were to happen. And so the chart that you see at the lower right there is the first of 2 charts that I'm going to show you from the Climate Impacts Assessment. And what it does is it gives a consequence rating in several different categories, in this case, for the increasing average annual temperatures. And so the way you interpret this is, it goes from a scale of 0 to 4. 0 is no impact. 4 is considered catastrophic. 3 is critical and 2 is limited. And when they say limited, it doesn't mean that the impacts are limited, it's limited in geographic scope. So basically anything from a 2 to 4 is really bad. But I'll point out to you there is 1-4 on that list, and that's for forests, ecosystems, and wildlife, because the projections are that most of the species that we find in Pennsylvania today, by the end of the century, if we do not do anything about our emissions, will not have the appropriate conditions to survive in Pennsylvania. So we're going to see a wholesale change in the types of plants and animals that we find in the state. Now, I think the one consequence that pretty much most people have noticed, whether they know what climate change is or believe what climate change is the changes in precipitation, specifically rainfall. Now, overall, we've seen a 10% increase in average annual rainfall in Pennsylvania, but it's really more a case of how the rain is falling. It's coming in much larger heavy rain events. And so the map you see at the left there shows you the percent increase in those rain events that would normally only occur 1% of the time. And you can see the Northeast US has seen a 55% increase. If we were to drill down to Pennsylvania, we've seen more than a 70% increase in these really heavy rain events. The maps to the right are once again from our climate impacts assessment for Pennsylvania, and it shows you that we're going to see a significant increase beyond what we've already seen. And the photo at the bottom is from our Loyal Sauk State Forest, and that is a bridge, culvert, roadway that was washed out. In the Loyal Sauk State Forest, we've had 3 500-year rain events in the past few years. Those are events that normally would only occur once every 500 years. And here we've had 3 of them in just the past few years. So these really heavy rain events are really a big issue all across the state. So let me get back to the Arctic a little bit, because this kind of explains a few things. And so what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. If you take a look at the graphic on the left, this is a look at the jet stream. And so I'm going to use my cursor here. Hopefully you can see it. You'll see that a stable jet stream, a normal jet stream, is this kind of river of air that circumnavigates the top of the planet. And it's what moves our weather patterns along. It's what moves the cold fronts. It's what moves the storms along. Generally speaking, it's very linear, and it moves really fast. What drives that jet stream is the temperature differential between the Arctic and the equator. But that temperature differential is declining significantly because the Arctic is becoming much warmer. As a result of that decline in the differential, you see what's shown here. The jet stream starts to wobble a lot and it slows down. And so the consequence is that you get storms forming and they don't move very much. And that partially accounts for these really heavy rain events that we've seen. It also leads to these really weird situations where you have warm air that moves much farther north than it would normally, and cold air that descends much farther south than it would normally. So if we jump to the graph on the right, this is looking at the polar vortex, which oftentimes the media doesn't use correctly. But basically, once again, we have this kind of wall of air that normally moves fast and is linear, and it contains the very coldest air during wintertime at the top of the planet. But because that temperature differential is dropping, we're seeing that polar vortex starting to wobble and slow down. And so one of the consequences is that it's not unusual to have at least a handful of days during the wintertime now where it is warmer in parts of Alaska than it is in Miami, Florida. So there's some really strange, weird stuff that's happening, all because of that warming that we're seeing in the Arctic regions. Now let's talk about snow, because we've talked about rain. And overall, we're seeing a really significant decrease in snow cover. So if you take a look at the graphic on the left, this is not a projection. This is what we've seen so far. The orange dots and circles show you places where we were seeing more rain in the wintertime and less snow, and blue dots are the opposite. And you can see there's a lot more orange dots than there are blue dots. And across Pennsylvania, with the one caveat that I'm going to mention here in a minute, we're seeing a lot less winter snow cover. So the graphic on the right is again a projection. This is from our climate impacts assessment. And you can see kind of historically, if we look at the northern part of the state, there are anywhere, from 80 to 90 days out of the year where you're likely to have some kind of snowfall. By the end of the century, keeping on the path we are now with our emissions, you can see that much of the state is only going to see maybe 20 days out of the year, and even the northern parts of the state, maybe 30 days out of the year. So we're going to see about, a third of the amount of snowfall that we've seen historically. And I said there was a caveat to that, and it, of course, it's Erie. And I don't have to, go into much detail on these pictures because you guys lived through it. But one consequence of climate change is that there's a projection for a significant increase in lake effect snow. And so generally when I give this presentation, I explain to folks what lake effect snow is, but I know I don't have to do that with you. But one thing maybe you didn't know is that if you take a look at the radar graphic at the bottom right, this is a lake effect snow from a couple of years ago. Lake effect snow, used to be confined to Erie County, Crawford County, maybe Warren, but right, just south of Lake Erie. But now it routinely makes it as far south as Hershey, where I live. Certainly not in the same amounts that you guys see, but it does lead to these really nasty snow squalls that develop along Interstate 80, which is why there is now, just a couple of years ago, they started these new snow squall warnings that will go up very rapidly when these develop. And it's also why Interstate 80 in Pennsylvania during the wintertime is ranked as one of the 10 deadliest highways in the country because of that sudden onset of those lake effect snow squalls. So this chart, I'm just going to take a minute or two to kind of explain, is once again a look at consequences as a result of climate change. And these are projections. And so if you look at the bottom axis, you'll see that the consequences are labeled. So for example, I'll note there's increasing average temperatures, and it goes along the way to heat waves and landslides, and then over to severe tropical and extratropical cyclones, which really don't affect you folks nearly as much as they affect us here in the eastern part of the state. The color shading within each of the bars refers to the impact itself. So for example, you'll see the dark blue at the bottom. That's the impact on human health. And so cumulatively, you look at the whole bar and you can see that for the most part, all of these are ranked at high or above. So they're all really significant impacts. One thing that's really interesting to point out, and I think is worth noting, is that the light blue color refers to the impact on environmental justice and equity. And in almost every one of these impacts, you'll see that it's among the most affected kind of segments, the exception perhaps being sea level rise, which really isn't a huge issue in Pennsylvania. And the reason for that is that looking at high temperatures and flooding. And so there was a recent study that was done that looked at 100 cities, and it looked at previously red-lined areas of the city, and they found that overall, those areas are 5 degrees warmer than surrounding areas as a result of having fewer trees and parks and the heat island effect. So there's that human health impact there. Also, those areas are more vulnerable to flooding because of impermeable surfaces, and they're less likely to receive aid after flooding occurs. And the last interesting thing to know when it comes to environmental justice, Hispanics and Latinos have a higher participation in weather-related exposed industries such as construction and agriculture. So they are also especially vulnerable to the effects of extreme temperatures. So there's a lot to unpack there, but DEP's put out this report, and it really is quite fascinating to look at these impacts. Another impact to consider is growing season. So there's pros and cons to some of this. So in the Northeast US, we've seen about a 10-day increase in growing season, which is great if you're a farmer or you're a vegetable gardener like myself. But there is a downside to that as well. And that's what you see in the photo to the right. That's from one of our state forests. And you'll see in the middle, it looks like there's a lot of dead trees. That's frost damage. And so we're seeing a significant increase in frost damage across our forests, because as you get those really warm days in late winter, it fools the trees and they bud. And then if you get a frost or a freeze, it kills the bud. Now, those trees aren't dead, but what they will not be able to do for at least this year is produce any kind of seeds or fruit or nuts. So that has a real significant impact on both reproduction and wildlife food availability. But also it takes them much longer to generate leaves. And so the sunlight will reach the forest floor in much larger quantities, if you will, and it starts to dry out the forest floor. So it changes the whole kind of ecosystem dynamics on the forest floor as well. Unfortunately, almost all invasive species and pests thrive under a climate change scenario. Here's two examples that we're seeing increase in Pennsylvania. On the left is kudzu, which is known as the vine that ate the South. It historically was kind of confined to the South, but we now have it in Pennsylvania. These photos are from the city of Lebanon, where you can see that it's growing really well, it's flowering, and it's making seeds, which the birds love to eat and spread around. And then on the right is the hemlock woolly adelgid, which historically was kind of held to the southern parts of the state. It kills our native hemlock tree. And because of the warmer winter temperatures, it's been spreading much farther to the north and to the west. So many more of our hemlocks are at risk. And of course, hemlocks are what's responsible for shading our cold water streams and ensuring that we have trout habitat. Now, let me quickly talk a little bit about some human health impacts here. The first is Lyme disease, which anybody from Erie, I'm sure, is familiar with, because if you go way back to when Lyme disease first appeared in Pennsylvania, Presque Isle was one of the hot spots. But you can see over time it's been spreading significantly. And the bar chart on the right shows you that increase over time. It only goes to 2017. But what I can tell you is that fully 1/3 of all Lyme disease cases in the US come from Pennsylvania. And it's because the ticks are active year-round now. They are producing more young, and the higher temperature and humidity are much more favorable for them to proliferate. Along with that, we have seen an increase in mosquito-borne diseases as well. And there's two reasons. One reason is that the number of days that mosquitoes are active throughout the year is longer than it used to be. And Erie has the lucky, I guess you would say, aspect of being, out of all the cities in Pennsylvania, has seen the greatest increase in mosquito active days. From 1970 to 2017, Erie's mosquito season has grown by a full month. So you're exposed to mosquitoes a lot longer. In addition to that, we have invasive mosquitoes moving in. And what you see at the lower left there is the Asian tiger mosquito. You don't have this in Erie yet, fortunately, but we do have them in the southern part of the state. They're active during the day. They bite really hard and really fast, and they carry a bunch of diseases, including the ones I have listed there, things like Zika virus, dengue fever, West Nile, and chikungunya virus. But they are spreading to the north and to the west, so it's probably likely that you will see them eventually in northwest Pennsylvania. Now, in terms of how this is going to impact species, the Audubon Society has done a study and shown that, in fact, almost all bird species have started shifting their range to the north. And a couple of those have been really notable. The wild turkey is now found 400 miles farther to the north than it used to be. The robin has shifted its winter range 200 miles farther to the north. And birds that used to migrate, like the red-tailed hawk, for the most part, do not migrate in most of Pennsylvania anymore because they have, open land with no snow cover, so there's food available year-round. A really cool example of some of these shifts we're seeing in species are things like the Carolina and black-capped chickadee. Now, you still have black-capped chickadees in Erie County, but the southern parts of the state, that bird has moved north. It's moving north at 1 kilometer a year, and it's being replaced by the Carolina chickadee. It may not be a good thing or a bad thing, but it's certainly an indicator of changes we're seeing as a result of climate change. Now, I just want to finish up by saying a little bit about, what can we do about this? And so there's kind of two things you can do. One is adaptation, the other is mitigation. And so let me just briefly mention climate change adaptation. At DCNR, we've developed a plan that has over 120 recommendations. for how we're going to deal with the impacts of climate change. But what I have here is just a few recommendations that come from Presque Isle's Climate Change Adaptation Plan, which was just released a few weeks ago. And Presque Isle is the only state park in Pennsylvania out of the 121 state parks that has its own climate change adaptation plan. And these are some of the recommendations that are included. Things like planting trees that are going to be better adapted to future conditions. That's a recommendation that we're using in other parts of the state as well. Certainly, the fluctuating lake levels that you're seeing, going from a record high level and potentially going to record low levels if the scientists are right in their projections, is really going to wreak havoc with the infrastructure up there. So it's time to perhaps look at some visitor facilities and infrastructure that can be more mobile and move from place to place. You're seeing a longer summer recreation season. So we're looking at things like staffing and other things, because as the winter season is reduced, summer season extends, then you need things like lifeguards, for example, at certain beaches for longer periods of time. And that's actually started to happen in Presque Isle. And then if there's areas of the park where particular hazards develop because of floods or seiches or severe weather, they're giving some thought to potentially installing gates throughout the park so that at short notice they can close up parts of the park in order to ensure visitor safety or to clean up after some kind of event. Now, in addition to adapting to climate change, we're also looking at how can you mitigate climate change. In other words, we're doing a lot of things to reduce our emissions, and I'm sure you've heard about that. Presque Isle just announced a few weeks ago the new solar array that's going up. I think it was Beach 8. So a lot of things like that going on, but you can also remove carbon from the atmosphere. And one of the best ways to do that is to plant a tree. And so we're looking at a lot of things across the state, including things like forested riparian buffers, which we heard about from our last speaker, is a great way to also absorb nutrients so you don't get as much nutrient feed into the lakes, leading to harmful algal blooms. Related to that also, urban and suburban tree planting. So that helps answer some of that kind of environmental justice or environmental injustice, if you will, in terms of the high temperatures we're seeing in cities and towns. And there's a few other things that you'll see there. This last piece that I'll show you, you may or may not have heard of. You might think it's a little bit of a crazy idea, but it's called carbon capture and storage. The idea is, and you can see it at the graphic at the lower left, is that you capture carbon from a source. And that source could be a power plant that's burning fossil fuels, or it could be an industrial facility. Then you take that carbon dioxide and you pump it underground into a rock strata where it can be held in perpetuity. This is an emerging technology. There's a few pilots across the country right now. I think you're going to see a lot more of it in the next 10 to 20 years. So related to that, if you take a look at a map on the right, DCNR is home to the Geologic Survey for Pennsylvania, and our geologists have identified rock strata that potentially could contain CO2. And all the shaded areas you see in the western part of the state, including Erie County, fall onto those rock strata. So potentially those are places where you could see carbon capture and storage in the future. And with that, hopefully I didn't take too much time. I would be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Greg. That was a ton of really great information. Do we have any questions from our panelists while we're waiting for some questions to come into the Q&A box?
I do. Thanks, Greg. And we just all saw in the news that that Presque Isle had released those climate recommendations on assuring that they have resilience there at the park. I was looking at some of the projections that you put up going towards the end of this century, and the number of days that we could potentially see that are over 90 degrees. Can you talk a little bit about the assumptions that go into that modeling to identify, some of the things that we're seeing as trends right now, such as moving towards renewable energy, moving away from hydrocarbons for our transportation networks, et cetera, and how those two things hopefully will resolve themselves in those maps.
Sure. In terms of the modeling, I wouldn't try to explain that, because certainly there's a pretty complicated modeling scenario they went through. Just for a little background, that is a DEP release plan. They worked with a consultant who developed those models, and that was worst case scenario. And so hopefully we won't see that. And I really didn't show you the scary part is when you look at the number of days potentially over 100 degrees. That's really scary. So the projection is, if we were to get our emissions under control, and so if we abide by the Paris Climate Accord, and that by 2050 at the latest, we decarbonize totally the world economy, that we will not see the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. And so the estimates are that it would take at least 50 to 75 years before warming would slow down, if that's the best case scenario. So we're still going to warm, but we won't hit that end of the century catastrophic situation. So there's still time to do something, but the time is really kind of running out. And I think you probably heard that most projections are, if we don't do something really significant within the next decade or so, then we're going to be in a really bad way.
Yeah, I don't think it would only be the Chickadees moving north. I also would be moving north. That also kind of touches on a topic that came up 2 weeks ago at the Great Lakes Commission. I serve as a Pennsylvania commissioner on the Great Lakes Commission. One of those sessions was on climate resilience and also how that feeds into climate migration. And so that we had a PhD from, I believe, Florida State University who was involved in migration science, as well as all the variables that go into a person's decision to move from one place to another. And it's pretty complicated. It doesn't just revolve around number of days that are hot, et cetera. There's a whole host of things that go into that. But one of the things that he said that I kind of internalized, and a lot of people I think took the wrong way on the Great Lakes, was that whenever people decide to move, they're generally only moving a small distance. They're moving to places that are closer, unless there's family ties or something they're further away. So we shouldn't expect to see people from Arizona come to Minnesota. But the fact is, looking at your map of the Commonwealth, our two largest population centers are in the most red projections for number of days that would see really hot conditions: Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. And where would those population centers consider moving if they wanted to stay in Pennsylvania? They come to the upper tier, or they might come to the Great Lakes because our proximity to water. And so I wanted to bring that up because I thought that was a pretty relevant connection to your presentation.
Yeah, I've read similar things to what you're talking about. And I think it was perhaps even Buffalo has already kind of labeled themselves as a climate-friendly city. If you think about the entire United States and the potential natural disasters you can encounter, the fires out west, places that are prone to hurricanes, places that are prone to earthquakes, Tornado Alley, which actually has shifted significantly to the south eastern part of the state. And then you look at the area around the Great Lakes, you have a very low incidence of any of that bad stuff happening. I mean, you have more snow, but that can be a good thing if you like snow. So yeah, the Great Lakes area is kind of viewed as a place where a lot of climate refugees, if you want to call them that, would eventually end up.
And I think that goes back to our infrastructure. In fact, I'll kind of refer over to the questions we had come in. If you have a lot of climate refugees or migration, those are going to have very significant effects on how our patterns of water use are, our patterns of water quality, the use of our infrastructure from water, wastewater, stormwater perspectives, but also transportation. And so with climate change, Carl DePolt mentions that it looks like we'll need to implement green infrastructure in a huge way. Do you have any kind of thoughts on that for Pennsylvania?
Well, I would agree for sure. Green infrastructure would be huge. green infrastructure is an example of adaptation. Recognizing that we're going to see these changes and we have to find a way to live with them. So if you live in an area like along the Great Lakes, I mean, now is the time when you should be thinking, we might see a really significant population increase. And so you start planning your infrastructure accordingly. But yeah, green infrastructure, particularly if you're talking about like green roofs or, some of the more modern types of buildings that you're seeing in other countries where they're literally like forests growing on the side of the building. That stuff goes a long way to reducing that urban heat island effect, which is something you really want to avoid if you get a big, increase in population. But also you find that buildings suddenly are able to sequester carbon, which is just a really cool thing.
Another question posed by Izzy Laurie was, what are the side effects of underground carbon storage and carbon capture?
It's a very good question. And it's such a new technology, I don't think anybody really knows. It's going to be quite the experiment. We just have to choose wisely where we decide to put that carbon. In some cases, it's always put very deep in particular types of rock strata. So it's way below the water table. The only real question is, how do you ensure that it doesn't come back out at some point? Even hundreds of years from now, that would still be a bad thing. So some of the rock strata, when it's pumped underground, it actually forms a liquid because of pressure, or in some cases, it forms a solid, actually reacts with the type of rock strata. So, I mean, I do, first of all, I'm not a geologist, but beyond that, I'm not sure how you would answer that question because it's really very experimental right now.
Another question from Judy Lynch is, looking at the cost of major storm events, whether they're along the Erie coastline or in other places, have there been estimates that we could expect from severe weather events?
That's a good question. In the environmental impact study that DEP had done, there may be some dollar estimates in there. Which is available on the DEP website. So that might be one place to start. But I really would assume there are probably other places you could find that kind of estimate as well. But offhand, I'm not sure where that would be.
Amber, how are we on time?
I think it's about time to move on to the next presenter, if that's all right. I know we have a lot of great questions in here, but we'll certainly get those over to Greg.
I noticed there were a couple more questions on there, and Greg, if you have a few minutes and you have an answer to any of those, I invite you to go ahead and post to that. And so with that, I think we will move on to the next session. So without any delay.
Okay, thank you so much, Greg. And to bring our focus a little closer to home, even though we talked a ton about Erie, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Jeanette Schnars, the Executive Director of the Regional Science Consortium, which is located here in Erie in the research wing of the Tom Ridge Environmental Center. Since 2014, the RSC has monitored the Pennsylvania coastline, including Presque Isle Bay and drinking water facilities for cyanotoxins produced by harmful algal blooms. The RSC also monitors bacteria and nutrient concentrations in the PA waters of Lake Erie. Dr. Schnars is responsible for 4 buoys and 2 weather stations that have been monitoring the water quality and weather in this region since 2006. In addition to water quality, the RSC also works on projects focusing on wetland restoration, fisheries, and shipwrecks. We welcome Jeanette's presentation titled Harmful Algal Bloom Cyanotoxin Monitoring, an update on the 2021 season. So with that, take it away, Jeanette.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Give me 1 second. Okay, you can see that, right?
Yep.
Okay. So thank you again for the invitation to this meeting. I appreciate having the opportunity to update everyone on the monitoring that we have been doing here at the RSC for the harmful algal blooms. Get in presentation. There we go. And okay. All right, so just kind of an overview. I know some of this might be review for people that have been to the LEEF meeting over the previous years, but we have been sampling for harmful algal blooms since 2014, and we actually started the sampling before the drinking water was shut down in Toledo. And so it's interesting that there's kind of two different mindsets, and yet we're so close to Ohio and Toledo, and we both pull our drinking water from Lake Erie. And that is that, you know, after that event happened in Toledo, the community there actually demanded that testing be done and routinely, and, you know, monitoring for the toxins that are produced by these harmful algal blooms. And, you know, where we are here, you know, people are definitely interested in it and pay attention to the postings that we have on our website, as well as on the health department website. However, funding is something that we have to, you know, ask for every year or every couple years. And so I do want to kind of give a shout out to Tim Bruno. He's been very supportive in that and helping us, you know, maintain funds to continue this monitoring over the last several years. And that's allowed us to create a great deal of momentum. So early on, you know, back in say 2015, 2016, 2017, people weren't really sure what harmful algal blooms were. Maybe they heard about it, but they thought it was just in the western basin of Lake Erie. And over the years, the RSC, as well as many of our collaborators and partners, have done a lot in terms of education and outreach to get the public up to speed with, you know, what HABs are, why it's important that we monitor them, how to find the information, and what to do or not to do if we're having a HAB event, or even if it's that time of year. And so if you kind of look at the photo on this slide, this is the ferry slip down at Presque Isle State Park, and that green streakiness that you see in the water is a pretty significant harmful algal bloom event. So, you know, that is very apparent, and we can, you know, often see these scum events at other locations that we sample. However, we also need to keep in mind that we can have high toxin concentrations in the water, and the water doesn't look like that. In fact, the water can look very clear or quote unquote clean, but the toxins are invisible. So we can have high toxin level when it doesn't look like this extreme event that we see here. So typically we do sample from May to October every year. Over the years from 2014 till now, we've been able to increase the number of days that we sample, which is once a week. So the number of weeks we sample, but we also have been increasing the cyanotoxins, the number of cyanotoxins that we sample for and the frequency that we analyze for them. So when we go out to sample, the sites are accessed from the shoreline. So RSC staff goes out, chest waders, you know, or with a long pole that the bottle attaches to at the end of a dock, and collects the water samples that way. However, we also need to keep in mind that harmful algal blooms can happen not only along the near shore, but throughout the lake. And so we need to start thinking about strategic places to sample, even though we see them congregate along the shoreline, and that is the most important place to collect samples. But we need to start thinking about other sites that might have to be accessed by boats that are a little bit further offshore, just to gain a better understanding of a harmful algal bloom event and what is happening in Lake Erie and how that's going to change over time. And that plays a lot with the information from the last presentation, looking at, you know, different changes in climates can change the behavior or bloom frequencies that we see with HAB events. We have 24 sampling sites that include Presque Isle Bay, Presque Isle Beaches, and the Pennsylvania Lake Erie coastline. And we're sampling all the way from Elk Creek near the Ohio border, all the way out to Freeport Beach near the New York border. So we are really covering all of the Pennsylvania waters along the shoreline that we possibly can. And then we also have samples that come in from Erie Waterworks and Northeast Drinking Water Authority. And so this includes their Lake Erie intakes, but for Northeast, this also includes Eaton Reservoir, Smith Reservoir, and Granville Reservoir. So these are their backup drinking water sites. And so it is important that they are aware of, HAB events that might be occurring in these reservoirs or that they might be pulling into their facilities. And depending on, the presence of blue-green algae or the presence of toxins can really change the way that they filter and process their water to get it ready for drinking water. So if we look at some of the sites, this is a map of west of Presque Isle State Park of the peninsula. So we sample at Elk Creek, Avonia Beach, and Walnut Creek, and then we'll start heading east from there. At the peninsula on the lake side, we have 6 zones that we collect water from. And so those are aligned with our beaches. And then zone 6, which I know they don't go in order, it goes zone 1 and then zone 6. But zone 6 is where our water quality buoy and weather station are. So we also sample there so that we can kind of pull together all of that information at a localized site and have the water information to go along with that. If we look at Presque Isle Bay, we sample several sites around the bay, from the eastern part all the way to the western part. And a lot of those sites we're either accessing from Presque Isle State Park or the city side at public access locations. And then if we look toward the east, we sample at Lake Cliff Boat Launch, which is part of Lawrence Park, Shades Beach, and Freeport Beach. So when we go out and sample for this season, we're going to talk specifically about the 2021 season. We collected from May 27th until October 21st. So that was just last week. So, some of the data we're still pulling together and still looking at. So this is just kind of a quick summary of what we've been able to look at thus far in the last week. So we sampled for 21 weeks. And the samples were, if we didn't collect them, if they came from the drinking water facilities, then they were delivered to us. So Erie Waterworks and Northeast Drinking Water Authority, they actually collect them from different parts of their facilities and bring them and deliver them to us. So once we receive the samples, we do the analysis in our lab. One of the big benefits of the Tom Ridge Environmental Center and having the Regional Science Consortium housed there in the research wing is we can collect water samples and drive back very quickly and start processing those water samples. And that's not the case at other areas, maybe across Pennsylvania, like other state parks or anywhere else. A lot of times those samples have to be sent out to an external lab. So this is a great benefit that we are able to have the lab here and accessible, and we can start processing those samples right away. Because with our bacteria samples, as well as our harmful algal bloom samples, there is a timeline that we have to adhere to make sure we process the samples in a certain time frame. So this year we were able to analyze for microcystin one time per week. Typically we're collecting water on Thursdays and we're getting those results out late Thursday, early Friday. For anatoxin A, we were collecting samples every other week. This year for saxitoxin, we increased the analysis to 1 time per week, so right along with microcystin. Prior to this, in previous years, we were only looking at saxitoxin once a month. And so cylinder spermopsin, that's that same time frame, we're analyzing that once a month. So we were able to increase the saxitoxin, and a couple of years ago, we increased the anatoxin analysis. So we were able to maintain the anatoxin, doing it at that frequency. And then for this year, for microcystin, we had 672 samples, water samples that were collected. When we bring those water samples back into the lab, we analyze them in duplicate. And so we double that number for the number of analyses that are conducted. And that just allows us to get better results, better numbers. We have, sample A, sample B, we take the average of that, and that just gives us a better result if we're able to take 2 samples from that same bottle, take a replicate or a duplicate. Anatoxin, we were able to collect 352 water samples, saxitoxin, 672 samples, cylinder spermopsin, 192 samples. And so at the end of the season, which just occurred a couple days ago, we were able to analyze 3,776 samples. And so we were able to have that many analyses. That's a lot of work for everybody at the RSC that works on this project. All of my staff did a phenomenal job. And if you think about it, most of the time that there was a thunderstorm, I shouldn't say thunderstorm, a rainstorm with torrential downpours usually happened on a Thursday when we sampled. It seemed like the weather would be great. Then on Thursday, we get this crazy weather events. Even the last time they sampled last Thursday, it was raining pretty hard. So a lot of credit to everybody that was water sampling, as well as getting it back into the lab and processing these samples in a timely manner so that we can get the results out to beach managers, waterfront managers, health department as quickly as possible. So we do use thresholds that once we analyze the samples, the number that we get, we put it against these thresholds to see where, if we have exceedances and at what level we have exceedances. And this threshold regime started out from the HAB task force that from our region here in Pennsylvania, and Ron Liebrook and Nate Irwin really worked hard to kind of organize all of the task force meetings, and then other partners such as the health department, DCNR, ourselves contributed to the writing of the strategy. And in that strategy, we outline the different thresholds. And we didn't come to these numbers just, purely by guess, but we referenced other areas that also were monitoring for harmful algal blooms and what thresholds that they were using. And then we did update these according to EPA recommendations. And then as EPA kind of finalizes those numbers, it is assumed that we will adopt those numbers as well. But these are the numbers that we're using right now, which are similar to other numbers and thresholds that are being used throughout the country. All right, so if we start to look at the data from this year, and remember, we're just pulling this together in the last couple days. So just looking at microcystins, so I mentioned we have 4 different cyanotoxins that we analyzed for, depending on what kind of blue-green algae are in the HABs, dictates what kind of toxins are produced. So the first one, microcystins, that's the most common, popular one. That's usually what happens in these blooms. That's usually what's being produced in many of them. And so the first thing I want you to look at is the bottom axis right here is the date. And then the axis on the side right here is the microcystin concentration. And then we have a lot of lines going on here. These are all of our sampling sites. So I realize that there's a lot of, it looks a little chaotic, but I just want you to get the idea overall of what is happening over time with these concentrations. The other thing to note on the graph is this red dotted line, which kind of gets consumed by our data lines, is the dog safety threshold. So if we exceed that threshold, that's when we notify DCNR as well as the Department of Health, Erie County Department of Health, and signage can then be placed. And I'll go over that more in a little bit. So if we look at this, you can see a lot of the microcystin concentrations really start to get elevated during that month of July. And so we had talked a long time ago about when would be a good time to sample, like, should we start as early as May? Should we go as late as October? And there's actually a lot of value into looking at a wider temporal span, because we can see that there is a little bit of activity early on. And so every year when we start, which is typically in May, every single year we have had an exceedance at one of our locations. So we've never started where it's been no exceedances, kind of like that clean bill of health. So we have always started with at least one site being an exceedance. And on the flip side, in October, when we do our last sampling, we have always had at least one exceedance. We were really hoping this year, 2021, we would get lucky. And as I was scrolling down the data, it was, below detection, below the thresholds. And I get to the very end of the table and we had one exceedance last week. So unfortunately, we ended our season where we still had an exceedance for microcystins, and that was at Eaton Reservoir. But you can see most of the activity is happening, most of the increase is happening right around that July period. And then we also have certain sites that are just kind of problem child. We have the Marina, we have Perry Monument, Ferry Slip, Niagara Boat Launch, Boaters Beach, which is right next to Beach 11, even Lake Cliff, which is part of Lawrence Park. All of those sites, when we get an exceedance, we might get them there and they might persist for a period of time. So this graph is just giving you an idea of when, and a couple of those locations and kind of some of the numbers of how large, like how much the concentration is. So anything over that 0.2 parts per billion, where that red dotted line is something where we would just recommend to beach managers, waterfront property owners, that they should consider posting a sign at those areas. Anatoxin A, we increased this or kept this at 2 times a month or every other week. We can see that we did have high concentration, very first sampling event, and then it kind of laid low for most of the summer, but then we see some activity happening, into October. So it's, a little bit of an increase there. However, that dog threshold line is at 0.4 parts per billion. So with each of these different cyanotoxins, we have a different threshold because each of the cyanotoxins acts differently. So, we're still well below that dog threshold. However, anatoxin, we need to keep good tabs on that one because it can be very dangerous. It can, this is the one where you hear about in the news, somebody's dog got in the water and it resulted in the dog becoming very ill or fatality. About 2 years ago, there was a story that came out of like Mississippi area, and it got national attention on the news. So this is something that even though it looks like we had a low year this year, we really need to pay attention to and continue to monitor. Now, saxitoxin, like I mentioned, is something that we looked at only once a month in previous years. However, that once a month, which might have only been 4 or 5 times over the course of the season, we were noticing that we were getting, it was detectable and we were kind of exceeding the threshold a couple of times. And so then the question was, if we're only looking at it once a month or a couple times during the season, what are we missing? And so we were able to get other funding from Coastal Zone Management to increase saxitoxin to once a week this year, which was very beneficial because as you can see early in the season, concentrations, relatively low, below that threshold. But as we progress into September and October, we see a lot of increase in the concentration, even exceeding the dog safety threshold. And so this one, again, we have to pay attention to because this is the one that when you have the shellfish toxin poisoning and you can't eat shellfish in the ocean areas, it has a very profound effect. And so, we need to know what's happening up here. So even if it's below the threshold, it's still information and it's still data, but we can see how it changed over time. And then we can start looking back at the question, why do we think it changed over time? And why do we see these increases during September and October of 2021? And then in this graph, this is just giving us an idea of just microcystin. So we're only looking at that one cyanotoxin, and we're looking at 2016 through 2021. And you can see all of the different locations along this horizontal axis here. You can see the microcystin concentrations, and we're averaging that at each site for the year. And then each of the different colors is a different year that you can see in the legend there. So again, just getting a sense of, maybe what other locations, might be areas where we see higher numbers. And so again, we see Perry's Landing popping up, Boaters Beach, as well as Horseshoe Pond, where the houseboats are on the park. And then we can also compare years as well. So 2019, we're seeing, we had some high numbers in 2019. And then 2020, it seemed like we kind of got, had some low numbers, and they started to increase a little bit this year from last year. So this just kind of gives you an overall sense of the different locations. Some locations just have higher numbers than other locations, and then how it varies over the last several years that we've been sampling. So once we get the samples, we get the results, we put an email out right away to the beach managers of DCNR, as well as Erie County Department of Health, as well as other waterfront managers. And all the email says is, at these sites, we exceeded the dog threshold, or a human advisory threshold, or a human restriction threshold for recreating in the water. And then it is up to them. They are the managers. We're just providing scientific information for them. As managers, they can choose to post signage or not if they think that other considerations are in play. We have several signs. So this one right here is for very high concentration levels where we're exceeding a human advisory or restriction level. And so it says no humans, no dog, no swimming. We rarely have to use this sign, which is fantastic. Typically we are exceeding the dog threshold. And so we have another sign that looks just like this, but it only has the dog in the middle and not the humans. And then DCNR also had another sign that they posted this year that was more informational, that was just to create awareness that, toxic algae could be in this area. Just please be aware of that. So this information goes out to our partners, and then they post signage or contact waterfront managers, owners to post signage from there. So the management part is not something that we do. And then we post the information onto this map here. The map can be found on our website, as well as the Erie County Department of Health website. This map was designed and constructed by Chelsea over at the health department. And what we can do is every week go in and update the data. So, if it's the HAB data, or if it's the E. coli bacteria data. And so this is somewhere that people can go and get, as up-to-date information as possible. Keep in mind, this map is only updated once a week, typically on Thursday. However, sometimes it's not updated until Friday, and that just depends on when we sample and get the samples processed. And then I just want to touch real quick on some of the research that we're doing. The saxitoxin research that I mentioned, we are able to sample once a week. And so now we can investigate the temporal and spatial relationship of saxitoxin, but we also wanted to look further into anatoxin as well during that recreational season of May to October. And we also wanted to investigate the relationship between cyanotoxins in relation to not only each other. So does the concentration of saxitoxin influence the concentration of other cyanotoxins that might be in the environment at the same time in the same area? But we also wanted to start looking at the environmental parameters. So, water temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen, air temperature, all of these things that we also collect this information. And we had worked a couple of years ago with USGS on using this information to start to develop a model. I will blame part of that pause in that work being due to COVID and not being able to sample other things in the water like we had previous years, but we hope to start that again next year or the year after. And then we also in this project are looking at the nutrients in the water, so nitrate and phosphate, and looking at the relationship of the concentrations of those nutrients to the occurrence of HABs and also the production of the toxins. Another project I want to mention real quick is we have been working on wetland restorations at Presque Isle State Parks. The wetlands there are termed priority wetlands. And so we have received funding since 2012 from Sustain Our Great Lakes, as well as have been working on the project with DCNR since 2009. We have other partners in this project, including Erie Bird Observatory, California University of Pennsylvania, and Ducks Unlimited. And it was predominantly started as removing invasive plant species, but we have really kind of shifted where we've removed a lot of the invasive plants. We're kind of managing and maintaining and continuing to treat, but we have really built up the propagation of native plants, which we go ahead into these sites and install these plants, which helps with reducing nutrient runoff into the waters, which kind of feeds these harmful algal blooms. Another project that we're finishing up is we looked at the cyanotoxins impact on the food web. And like I mentioned, saxitoxin is known to accumulate in shellfish. So we started to investigate the accumulation of microcystins in zebra and quagga mussels, as well as round gobies that consume these mussels, and macroinvertebrates as well, and the water. So we were looking at all of these different factors in different sampling sites. We just a couple weeks ago got some of these results back, and they were very interesting. We actually see that quagga and zebra mussels did test positive for certain congeners of microcystins. So they are accumulating the microcystins in their tissues. And the composition of the congeners within the mussel tissue is similar to that of the surrounding water. So it's an interesting connection between the two. And finally, I want to mention that we have 4 buoys and 2 weather stations, which also play into us helping monitor for blue-green algae in the water, which produces bloom events, which produces cyanotoxins. We have a buoy off of the Presque Isle Lighthouse. It's called the Nearshore Buoy. We have one off Walnut Creek, a smaller one off Beach 2, and a smaller one off Beach 6. And thanks to funding from the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, we were able to upgrade all of these buoys, get them out this year. And all of these buoys have blue-green algae sensors on it. So we are able to monitor for the presence of those cells, those blue-green algae cells in the water at these locations. We also have the DEP Presque Isle Bay buoy. So that is a project led by Nate Irwin, and also with funding from the HABs monitoring I mentioned provided through Tim Bruno. And so the DEP buoy is also looking at blue-green algae in the bay, which as you could kind of see, a lot of our sites in the bay were hotspots for harmful algal bloom toxins. These buoys transmit data every 20 minutes when they're deployed. They are typically deployed May through October. So the buoys we have out now are going to get pulled at the end of this week or next week. You can see everything's happening. It's the end of the season. Everything's happening, you know, in the last couple of weeks or very soon. And you can access this data on a smartphone app, which is called Live Data Center, or on our website, palakeribuoy.com. And so that is the end of my presentation. I know that we're a little over time, so Amber, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. Do you have time to stick around for a couple questions?
I could probably do 1 or 2 real quick.
Okay. Do we have any questions from our panelists? Hans, you have your hand up?
Yeah, that was a great talk. And you got a ton of data. Here's just a suggestion. The microcystin it was really interesting that, you know, they all kind of peaked out at the same time. It would be really interesting if you collect chlorophyll, for example, and see whether there's a strong correlation there between chlorophyll and the microcystin toxin concentration. You know, you might be able to use chlorophyll as a predictor of where to actually intensify those measurements. And I personally have a lot of interest in the microcystin sort of temporal data. We think that microcystin is highest early in the year when there's a lot of nutrients around, particularly nitrogen, because it requires a lot of nitrogen to synthesize microcystin. So, you know, that might be another kind of interesting correlate. And then the last thing I was going to mention is, in addition to measuring dissolved forms of nitrogen and phosphorus, it'd be useful to measure TN. You guys probably do this already. Measure total nitrogen and total phosphorus, because I think often what you see when you measure the dissolved forms, that's sort of what's left out there, you know, as opposed to what's really sitting in the algae. So I think if you can measure TN and TP at the same time, that would be really, really very useful. And I'd be more than glad to stay in touch with you, Jeanette, to see how that works out for you.
That would be great. No, I am grateful for the recommendations, and that'll give us more things to ask for grant funding for.
That's a good point, Jeanette, is that, you know, the funding that goes through DEP to the Regional Science Consortium is Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding. And so that's federal funding that's appropriated by Congress and comes down through the United States Environmental Protection Agency to us. And so, you know, luckily we have that, and hopefully we can continue to get that going off into the forward to sustain the monitoring there. Amber, I think with that, we're pretty far behind. We should probably move on, but thank you very much, Jeanette, for all the summary of this year's activities. And if you could just, if you do have a second, there is a question inside of the question and answer column regarding satellite imagery. That's a very good point, but I don't think we can cover that right now. So if you have some info, please feel free to answer that question.
Okay, sounds
Amber.
good. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Amber, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Jeanette, and thank you, Tim. I think we're going to have to skip our next polling session and move straight to the last half of this meeting, well, last third of the meeting. The remainder of the meeting consists of a few updates from local programs. So first up, we'll hear from Sarah Stallman, the extension leader of Pennsylvania Sea Grant, for an update about the ongoing LEEF project.
All right. Thank you. I will try to make this quick and hopefully recoup some time. I've been on the past couple LEEF meetings just to give updates on what we're doing with the Community Resilience Action Network of Erie. And there we go. Just a quick recap if you're not familiar with what that group is. We call ourselves CRANE for Community Resilience Action Network of Erie, and we're essentially an alliance of organizations throughout Erie County with kind of the same mission of building climate resilience with a formal mission of engaging the community using education and collaboration to identify climate vulnerabilities and implement proactive responses that preserve a vibrant and resilient region. So you can see some of the partners that we have listed here. We also have the health department, and I don't have the logo for that yet, but that's one of our more recent partners that have joined our team. And it might have been the last LEEF meeting, maybe the one prior, where I shared information about a project that we received funding for through GLESA, the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments Program. And ultimately what we're doing with this project, just as a quick recap, is to help move Erie County through the Steps to Resilience framework, which looks like 1, exploring hazards, 2, assessing vulnerabilities and risk, 3, investigating options, 4, prioritizing and planning, and 5, taking action. So ultimately, working through these various steps that will help us to better recover from severe weather and more frequently occurring extreme weather. And if you want to learn more about the project, there is a project page on our Crane website, which is pacrane.org. You can get to it through the homepage, or you can use the link that is shown up on the screen. And there's a lot more detail than I'm able to go into with the time that I have on this quick update. So we're focusing with this GLESA funding on kind of the first 3 steps within the steps to resilience from the Climate Resilience Toolkit, the US Climate Resilience Toolkit. So the first one, explore hazards. This is actually a screenshot of the website. So if you can actually, when you go on the website, you can actually click onto the explore hazards icon. And that will give you more information about weather events impacting Erie and how we're being impacted and how we're hoping to cope with those impacts. We got a lot of data specifically for the Erie region from GLESA, which was really nice. And so we're actually working on making sure that all of that data and information is available on the website so that people can access it. What I'm focusing more on in this quick update is the assess vulnerabilities and risks portion. So this is where we're at right now. So we did a lot of the getting data on the hazards. We had an Erie extreme weather survey that I shared on one of the previous LEEF meetings, and that's where we kind of gathered all the data. And now we're going to get to the point of really talking with municipal leaders to get information that can help us answer questions in a vulnerability assessment that will help gauge our level of preparedness in various sectors of our community. So looking at things like our transportation systems and critical infrastructure and so on. So again, you'll be able to go on and get more information on the website. And the coming soon is when we get to the next step, which is going to actually be taking that information and start brainstorming action strategies that we can take to build resilience in our community. So to assess our vulnerabilities and risks, we are hosting a in-person community engagement session. This first one's going to focus on municipal leaders like township officials, floodplain managers, code enforcement officers, et cetera, to help us answer these very specific questions that are going to kind of help us prioritize our the regions of our, or the sectors of our communities where we're going to need to put the most resources and time and funding to implement projects. So this session is going to be held on December 8th from 9 to 12 p.m. in the Blasco Library Admiral Room. This information is on the website, and there's actually currently a link to register. So if you fall kind of within that municipal leader or floodplain manager, et cetera, kind of area of expertise, we would love to have you there. If you're interested in getting involved in the process and you're not in one of those leadership roles at this time, don't worry. The next step is going to be bringing together all members of the community to have conversations about kind of the results of this initial session, and then go more into brainstorming solutions. And so we will invite everybody into that particular session. So this is just a quick snapshot of what the assessment essentially looks like. This is just one quick example. There's several different weather profiles. This is an example of the heavy rain profile that looks at kind of a benchmark scenario. So something that's happened historically that's been pretty significant. And then looking at a credible worst case scenario condition and having conversations about, all right, this is what something already happened that looks this bad. Were we prepared for it? You got to answer these kind of yes or no questions regarding, I pulled out transportation. So you could kind of get an example and then think about it in this credible worst case scenario. So what if it's worse? What kinds of things will we need to focus on? So that's what this vulnerability assessment is. It covers multiple weather hazards and multiple sectors of the community. So very quick and dirty, I just wanted to kind of share what we're working on right now, and hopefully on a next LEEF meeting, I'll be able to share more information about the outcomes of that engagement session and what we're going to be doing with the brainstorming sessions. So thank you, Amber, that's all I have.
Okay, thank you so much. Do any of our panelists have quick questions for Sarah? Or anyone type them into the chat? Okay. Well, if any come up, we will be sure to get those out to you, or you can answer them as they come up through the Q&A. So with that, we'll move on to our next update, which is actually coming from me. I wanted to share just a brief introduction with all of you to the Master Watershed Steward Program, in case you're interested in joining or participating. Let me share here. So this will be very, very brief. Oh, I can't go into, there we go. Okay. So I hope you're not seeing presentation mode, but you might be. We'll just go over this really quickly. So the Master Watershed Steward Program was recently launched in Erie, Crawford, and Warren. And I, through Pennsylvania Sea Grant and Penn State Extension, am the program coordinator for the 3 counties. And this is a picture here of all of us kayaking during our second field session at Chapman State Park in Warren County. The program has been growing since 2013. Since that time, it has successfully acquired 56,000 volunteer hours, and over 200,000 Pennsylvania residents have received education about water stewardship. So that's truly what this whole program is about. It's educating residents about water and about how to become stewards of water. And the impacts were pretty vast in 2020, even though it was an interesting year for all of us. In 2020, the program monitored over 60 streams in Pennsylvania, planted over 7,000 trees, dispersed 108 rain barrels, wrote 29 educational articles, installed 30 rain gardens, and restored 26.55 acres of habitat. And there's plenty of work to do. As you all probably know, Pennsylvania has more than 86,000 miles of rivers and streams, and 29,000 of those miles are considered impaired by DEP. So that really drives home the importance of this program and its growth and success. And we can't have growth and success without partnerships. So here I've just listed our statewide steering committee members, and that's just a handful of the many. And I've also listed the local partners to the Erie, Crawford, and Warren program that have decided to partner with us in just the last few months of my employment. So partnerships are very, very incredibly important to the program. So if anyone out there would like to join the program, either as a participant, you could be one of our next stewards in training, or you can be one of our many wonderful partners to provide things like support and education. And that's not always necessarily financial. It can be, training our stewards on, for example, how to plant native plants, which that's what they're doing in this picture down on Presque Isle that was just taken a couple weeks ago. So that was a very, very quick update from me. One final thing is that the next training will be taking place in spring of 2022. And I can be reached at my email here, which all of you should have through connecting through the LEEF presentation today. But also you can sign up on our website and check out some more of our information. And I'll include these links in the notes. And those will be posted to the website for the LEEF meeting. Does anyone have any questions for me?
No, that's great. Thank you, Amber. And one thing I wanted to bring up is our original slated item for 3:45 through 4 o'clock was for us to provide the opportunity for attendees to update us on current events that they might be interested in, any comments, and then identify any issues and recommended future topics. And as we have our last presenter, Jackie Bonomo, talking on behalf of Penn Futures, I was hoping that, if you do have any of those topics, if you could start dropping those into the question and answer box so we can kind of do those on parallel tracks. But that's what I wanted to mention. Back to you.
No, sounds good to me. And thank you, Carl, for dropping the link to the Master Watershed Steward Program into the Q&A. I said thank you, so not move to the answered section. So if anyone wants to click on that, it's there for you. And our final update, I'll move on to Jackie Bonomo, President and CEO of Penn Future. She's going to share an update on the common agenda as it relates to climate change and water in Erie. So go ahead, Jackie.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone. Thank you for sticking with me. Okay, just almost there. So my question is, can you see the presenter view or are you just seeing my screen?
I'm just seeing your screen.
Perfect. Hey, everyone. And I'm also, one more thing I need to do here. Thanks again for having me. I apologize for the spooky light. I'm in our Pittsburgh office today and it's a little bit abandoned here, as you can see. So I wanted to just take a little bit of time to update you on where we are with the apropos parts of the common agenda. And by way of background, let me just say that in 2020, Penn Future established a presence in Erie. And our intent is still to actually open a physical office there. And that's been delayed, unfortunately, due to COVID. But at the time, we were able to bring on a really talented person named Sarah Bennett, who served as our clean water campaign manager for Pennsylvania's portion of Lake Erie. And the first piece of work that we set out to do was developing something that we call a common agenda. So our work in Erie focuses on water, and we're intending to bring resources and expertise to replicate major programs in water that we have in other parts of the state, particularly working in the Susquehanna and Delaware watersheds. But we're also interested in helping build capacity in the community to deal with emerging issues to the lake watershed. So in November of 2020, we published this common agenda. It was developed using a bottoms-up approach and process that involved a great many groups, several of which are with us today, everyone that is listed here on this slide. We also had a team of technical advisors and social justice reviewers, and we really want to thank them for their great work and assistance. We really believe that this agenda is the first of its kind for the region in that it provides a comprehensive treatment of threats to the lake's environment and a series of recommendations for the public, organizations, and policymakers for addressing these threats. So I do want to share with you here the full list of issues that the agenda treats. But while they're all interrelated, today I'm really going to only focus very briefly on the headlines related to climate change, and hope that when you have a chance, you'll take some time to familiarize yourself with the whole of the agenda. So part 4 of the agenda deals with climate and extreme weather, and thanks to everyone who sort of set up the case, I guess, for dealing with this issue in Pennsylvania's portion of Lake Erie, the region in general. So according to Climate Central, you all might be aware of that entity. The city itself is experiencing profound effects. Climate Central looked at temperature change in 246 locations in the United States from the first Earth Day in 1970 through the 1920 Earth Day. And it found that Erie is one of the 10 most warming places in the country, and that it's experienced a 4.3 degree annual average increase versus most of the other locales that they looked at, which had experienced an increase of about 2.4 degrees. 98% of the other locales measured experienced that. This phenomena or fact is largely attributed to the amount of impermeable surface in the region. And it's also important to mention that the city's historically redlined areas are withering under the heat island effects, where temperatures during heat waves are almost 4 degrees higher than in historically non-redlined areas, making underserved neighborhoods far more adversely impacted by the increasing number of severe weather events. So the common agenda really contemplates climate impacts as a top priority for the city and county to address as a climate emergency, as a public health emergency that, if not addressed, will continue to exacerbate historic racism, including environmental injustice being exacted upon many residents of color in the area. I just wanted to say too that the timing of this meeting today couldn't be more apropos, with Congress locked in major negotiations to address greenhouse gas emission reductions in the energy and transportation sector, and also looking at measures to implement some of what was talked about today by your other presenters, particularly natural and other infrastructure that will help us build resiliency and perhaps hasten adaptation. And of course, in just a couple of days, the convergence of world leaders and climate activists in Glasgow for COP26. The measures and recommendations, some of which we've bulleted out here, are still stand. There's really no better time, for example, for the public to be urgently pressing elected officials and candidates for climate commitments. First and foremost, to be asking for an action and justice-oriented climate plan for their jurisdictions, and for them to provide funding for implementation. There are many opportunities and other actions at the municipal and county level that have been identified in the plan. The region has made a great start through some really visionary tree planting projects. Amber's Master Watershed team has done some important work in that area. And that natural infrastructure is really a critical antidote to addressing the impermeable surface problem that's not only warming the region, but it's also making stormwater management a major challenge. So it's just one example of progress in the area that needs more municipal support. And the residents of the area have got to have a voice and more transparency from elected officials on environmental decisions. And that's why Penn Future has placed such a high priority, along with several other partners, on a recommendation to create an environmental advisory committee in Erie. Penn Future's statewide climate policy priority to reduce climate pollution, improve public health, and hasten the just transition into cleaner energy is the admission of Pennsylvania into the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And I'm happy to say that after 24 months of rulemaking, of working on this rulemaking, we hope to see Pennsylvania enrolled in that program in the first quarter of 2022. I also just want to touch briefly on the tangled topic of fracked gas, petrochemicals, climate, and Lake Erie that gets a look in part 5 of the common agenda. And I'm going to preface this by saying that I'm going to treat this matter a little more starkly than how it's addressed in the common agenda. So you all might be aware that plastics manufacturing, particularly injection molding, is very big business in Erie. And some economic boosters in that part of the world really see the completion of Royal Dutch Shell's fracked gas source ethane cracker in Beaver County as a source of plastic pellet feedstock that's not only going to stabilize the industry, the plastics industry in Erie, but grow it. So to the climate angle, Shell's ethane cracker was permitted to pump 522 tons of volatile organic compounds into the air. That means that is nearly double the amount of the state's current largest source of volatile organic compounds, which is US Steel's Clarendon Coke Works near Pittsburgh. The permit also allows Shell to produce and release 2.25 million tons of carbon dioxide. That means that this one plant is going to wield a carbon footprint that's 1/3 the size of our largest cities, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And elected officials contemplate the building of 2 additional petrochemical facilities, massively subsidized by taxpayers somewhere else in the state. And I worry a lot for whatever communities might be targeted next to the next to these petrochemical facilities. So in addition to the common agenda's other recommendations, we feel that it's really imperative for Erie to diversify into earth-friendly industries and jobs that are much more benign to our climate and public health. I've been following with a lot of interest the work being done by Wabtec. It's a company in Erie that is manufacturing hybrid locomotives for New York subway system. And Wabtec's company and union leaders have plans to go even further in this industry using electricity and cleaner forms of energy than fossil fuels. So this is proof that industry and manufacturing can be greener and much more sustainable, and it's happening right there in the Erie area. So that was super fast. With that, I am going to stop my share and hope that when y'all have a chance, you'll spend a little bit more time digesting the common agenda.
Thank you so much, Jackie.
You're welcome.
Does anyone have any questions for Jackie? from our panelists or type them into the Q&A. Okay, I don't see anything coming through just now, but if something comes through, I will send them your way. All right, and so that brings us almost to the end. I'm going to turn it back over to Tim for a couple last minute notes and the adjournment.
Great, thank you. And of course, thank you to all the presenters who took time out of their day to come give us some excellent information on climate change, water quality, harmful algal blooms. And it gives you all something to talk with your relatives about around the Thanksgiving table this year as to some of the things that they should be aware of and how we should go about addressing the changes that potentially each one of us needs to make to assure that climate change does not get any worse, and that we progressively move towards reducing nutrients inside of our waterways. So with that, thanks to all of the folks, the presenters, as well as those folks at Sea Grant, Amber and Kelly, and we will see you all during our next meeting, which is scheduled for, Amber, do you have that date handy?
I do not have it right in front of me. I can find it really quick.
I think it's tentatively scheduled for Tuesday, January 25th, 2022. And so with that, we will see you all then.
Thanks, Tim. Confirmed that's the right date. Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording now.